Hello everyone, I am the Macabre. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Sit back and relax. The Shadow of the Psychopath. Chapter 1. The First Drawing. The apartment was eerily silent when Detective Alejandro Marquez entered. He was used to the usual noise of bustling officers, footsteps on the hardwood floors, the hum of distant radios. But here, in this forsaken apartment, everything felt still. The space was barren, stripped of life. Just a single body, a man in his late 30s, sprawled on the floor as though he had simply collapsed, his face frozen in an expression of shock, as though he had never seen the death coming. Yet it wasn't the man's body that made Marquez's skin prickle, it was the wall behind him. The scene felt designed, like some grotesque stage. The man lay in a pool of blood, but the real horror wasn't in the blood, it was in what had been done to the wall. The blood had been used to create something, a drawing. At first glance, it might have seemed like a child's crude attempt at art, but upon closer inspection, there was an unsettling precision to it. A dark, jagged shape of lines and curves, almost geometric, surrounded by chaotic splotches. It was a triangle, inverted, with a shape in the center, twisted and unnatural. The lines seemed to spiral, almost as if they were in motion, drawing the eye toward them with a hypnotic, terrifying effect. Marquez squinted, leaning in closer. It was the texture that caught him first. The blood had dried, but the way it spread across the wall didn't look entirely human. It had a strange gloss to it, a sheen, almost as if something or someone had deliberately mixed it with another substance. His stomach churned and he straightened up, scanning the room. "You see this?" Marquez called over his shoulder to his partner, Detective Lina Rodriguez. She stepped into the room, her expression already hardening as her eyes fell on the drawing. "It's not just blood," she said, her voice calm but edged with tension. "It's been arranged." They both stood silently for a moment, processing the unsettling sight. The victim's body, though lifeless, looked as if it had been positioned with care, not haphazardly discarded like in many other crime scenes. The walls, cold and empty, except for that strange, bloody mark, seemed to press in on them, as if the apartment itself were alive, watching. Lina knelt down beside the victim, her gloved hand brushing against the man's wrist. "No sign of a struggle," she murmured, her fingers lightly touching the man's cold skin. "Whoever did this, they wanted him to die peacefully." She paused, looking back at the wall, almost like a performance. Marquez nodded slowly. He knew what she meant. This wasn't just a murder, it was an act, and the killer had orchestrated every detail with an artist's eye. The question, of course, was why. What kind of mind could look at a body and create something like this? They moved around the apartment, checking for other clues. There was no sign of forced entry, no obvious evidence of robbery or personal motive. The victim's wallet was intact, his phone untouched. It was as if the killer had chosen him for something other than practical reasons. But then Lina's voice cut through the heavy silence. "Marquez, look at this." She was pointing at the floor near the back door. There, beneath a small table, was a single sheet of paper. It was crumpled, stained with a streak of blood, but there was something on it, a smaller drawing. The same twisted triangle shape, but this time the lines were sharper, more deliberate, and at the center was a symbol Marquez couldn't quite place. Lina held up the sheet carefully, her eyes narrowing. This is something else. It's like a map." Marquez took the sheet, his heart racing as he studied it. He had seen things like this before, in cases the obsessive notes of killers who thought they were sending a message. But this felt different. The artist wasn't just trying to be noticed, he was leading them somewhere. "We need to get this analyzed," Marquez muttered, his mind already racing ahead. The drawing wasn't just some random symbol, it was connected to something deeper, something methodical. "This isn't the first crime like this, is it?" Lina didn't need to answer. Marquez already knew the truth. They had seen similar patterns before, scattered across other crime scenes in the city. Each had been dismissed as a coincidence, a random outburst of a sick mind. But this one was different. This felt like a game. As they left the apartment to brief their team, Marquez couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just chasing a killer, they were walking into a trap. Somewhere, in the shadows, someone was waiting, watching. And the worst part? He knew they were already too late. The game had begun. Chapter 2. The Psychological Game. The next few days passed in a haze of unanswered questions and mounting dread. The drawing from the first crime scene, more accurately described as a symbol, was sent to forensic experts, but none could give an immediate explanation. It wasn't just art or random madness. It had structure, meaning as if it was directing them towards something. Marquez spent hours poring over the photographs of the crime scene, the marks on the wall, and the cryptic sheet of paper Lena had found. But every time he thought he had a lead, it slipped away, like smoke between his fingers. In the meantime, Detective Lena Rodriguez had begun investigating the patterns in the killings. She had a gut feeling that the symbols on the wall weren't just a means of terror. They were predictions. The more she studied the images, the more certain she became. It wasn't just about the deaths. It was about foretelling them. A strange sense of urgency crawled under her skin as the first image, the chaotic triangle, started to form a disturbing pattern with the others they had uncovered. She had found old, unsolved cases where similar drawings had appeared, all around the city, tied to previous murders, all too perfect in their order. "I don't think these are just symbols. I think they're clues," Lena said one morning as she and Marquez sat in the station's dimly lit conference room. The city's skyline spread out like a distant, lifeless painting behind them. "Each one of these is like a piece of a puzzle. We're supposed to figure out what happens next." Marquez rubbed his temples, the weight of the case starting to sink in. The more they uncovered, the less sense it made. There were no clear patterns in the victims themselves, no shared traits, no connection. Each one had seemed random, an anonymous person plucked from obscurity. But the drawings were something else. They weren't random. They were deliberate, carefully thought out. Lena pulled out another file, one of the older cases. It was a murder from 2 years ago, a man found dead in a car, his body twisted grotesquely, with a large, intricate symbol drawn across the windshield in what looked like blood. The symbol was familiar. It was a variation of the triangle from the latest murder, but this one had a curve at the base, like the edge of a crescent moon. "I've seen this before," Lena muttered. She stared at the image, feeling the pieces begin to shift into place, even though she couldn't quite understand what the full picture was. The symbol, was it a warning? A signature? Or worse, a promise? Was the killer trying to tell them something, or was he merely toying with them? "That's the thing," Marquez said quietly. "There's no real pattern to the victims, but there's definitely a pattern to the killings." He leaned forward, tapping the file. "And I think that pattern is going to be the key to everything." Their conversation was interrupted by the sudden ringing of Lena's phone. She answered quickly, and her face went pale as she listened, her eyes flicking nervously to Marquez. "Another one," she whispered, before hanging up. It took them less than an hour to arrive at the next crime scene, a high-rise apartment near the edge of the city. This time, the drawing was on the floor. The victim, a young woman in her 20s, was lying on her stomach, eyes wide open in fear, her hand clutching something, a small note that read, "You're next." The message was chilling enough, but what made Marquez's blood run cold was the pattern on the floor next to her body. It was the same inverted triangle, but the lines were more deliberate now. Sharp, precise. It had a sense of finality to it, like the killer was drawing closer to something or someone. Lena knelt beside the body, taking in the details of the crime scene. "He's getting more confident," she muttered. "More detail. The drawings are changing." Marquez watched her closely, and more personal, it feels like. "These symbols are no longer random. They're telling a story, a very specific one." He stepped back, letting the sense of dread seep into his bones. "The question is, who's next?" As they began to process the scene, Marquez's mind spun with unanswered questions. The more they uncovered, the less clear the case became. What was this killer's endgame? Was he trying to communicate with them, or was he leading them to his next victim? And why these strange drawings? They were more than just a signature. They were the killer's language, his twisted method of storytelling, his means of forcing the detectives into a mind game they didn't understand. And it was becoming clear now that the killer wasn't going to make it easy. In fact, With every new crime, every new drawing, he was taking them one step deeper into a labyrinth of terror that only he knew the way out of. Chapter 3: The Art of Death. The third murder was a departure from the others, and the detectives felt it the moment they stepped inside. The apartment was eerily pristine, almost sterile, save for the scene in the middle of the living room. A body was propped up against the wall, sitting upright as if the victim had been positioned, like a sculpture or a mannequin. The man's face was covered with a cloth, but his hands, folded neatly on his lap, told a story of terrifying intent. There was no blood splatter this time, no chaos, just stillness. Detective Lina Rodriguez was the first to speak, her voice unusually quiet. "This is different." She reached for her notebook, her eyes scanning the scene methodically. "This doesn't feel like a random murder. It feels deliberate." Marquez stepped closer to the body, his breath catching slightly as he observed the details. The victim's posture unnatural, yet arranged so meticulously spoke volumes. It was as if the killer had been patient this time. There was no rush, no panic, just methodical calculation. Then he saw it, a drawing. But this one wasn't on the walls nor on the floor. It was on the back of the victim's neck, done in the same twisted style as the others. Only this time, the symbol was clearer, a skull with dark, hollow eyes, surrounded by a series of lines that seemed to stretch outward like cracked porcelain. Lina was already taking pictures, her brow furrowed in concentration. This symbol, it's not just a prediction, it's like he's marking his victims now. She turned to Marquez, her voice low. "This is a signature, a way for him to say, 'I was here.'" Marquez nodded grimly, studying the symbol closely. "But this one's different. This isn't just about the victim anymore. He's creating something bigger." He stood back, rubbing his chin as he took in the entirety of the scene, the carefully arranged body, the eerie stillness of the room. The way everything seemed to lead the detectives into a deeper mystery. It wasn't just the act of murder, it was a performance. "This is his art," Lina said, almost to herself. "It's like he's crafting something. Every murder is part of his masterpiece." The realization hit Marquez like a brick wall. Each death, each drawing was a piece of a larger picture. But what was he trying to create? What was the purpose behind it all? The killer wasn't just looking for death, he was seeking to communicate, to express something through violence. There was a grotesque elegance in the way the crime scenes were unfolding. It was as if the killer was choosing his victims not for who they were, but for what they represented. As they examined the scene, the forensic team found something else. A notebook, hidden underneath a couch cushion. It was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with drawings. But these weren't the hastily scrawled symbols from the previous murders. These were finished pieces, detailed, intricate works of art. Each page depicted violent scenes, twisted renditions of death and suffering, but the drawings were immaculate. There were depictions of faces, contorted in agony, surrounded by geometric patterns that mimicked the triangles seen in the crime scenes. And in the corner of each page, the same signature, a small symbol that resembled a shadow, a dark shape that seemed to pulse off the page. Lina flipped through the notebook, her fingers trembling slightly. These aren't just sketches. These are his visions, his creation. Her voice was filled with awe and horror in equal measure. He sees these murders as a form of expression. Marquez leaned over her shoulder, his own stomach turning as he took in the horrific images. And every piece is part of something larger. He's creating a narrative, a story we're supposed to understand. He straightened, his mind racing. But what's the end game? What's the final piece of this story? They had no answers, but the chilling feeling of being drawn into something bigger only intensified. The killer wasn't just playing a game of cat and mouse with the police. He was crafting something monumental, something that was about to come to its final deadly crescendo. As they left the apartment, Marquez felt the weight of the case press down on him harder than ever. This was no longer just a murder investigation. This was a race against time. The killer had control, and with each new crime, the story he was telling grew darker, more complex. The drawing on the back of the victim's neck was just another clue, another step in the journey the killer had planned for them. But the question remained, what would happen when they finally reached the end of his twisted masterpiece? For For the first time since the case had begun, Marquez felt like they were no longer just chasing the killer. They were part of his story now. And the final chapter? It was still to be written. Chapter 4, The Psychopath's Childhood. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during a routine review of the victimology and background checks on the most recent victims. Detective Lina Rodriguez had spent hours analyzing the details, searching for any hidden connection, when she stumbled upon something buried deep in one of the victims' pasts. A name that had come up several times in unrelated investigations. A name that, in hindsight, seemed far too significant to ignore. It was the name of a woman, someone who had been linked to more than one of the city's previous murder cases, both as a possible accomplice and as a key psychological figure in the lives of certain victims. Her name was Alicia Moreno, a psychologist who had worked in the local school system years ago. But Alicia wasn't just a counselor. She was a manipulator, a woman whose influence seemed to extend far beyond the classroom. And as Lina dug deeper, she uncovered something far darker. Alicia Moreno had once been the primary caregiver to the killer himself. Marquez was the first to hear the news. He had been pacing in his office, his mind racing with the details of the murders, when Lina burst in with the file in her hands. "Alicia Moreno," she said, her voice tight. "She's the key. And I think she's been involved in this for years." The name rang a bell. Marquez knew of her, but he hadn't connected the dots until now. "She was a psychologist," he muttered, leaning over the file. "But this is more than just therapy. What was her relationship with the killer?" Lina flipped open the folder. She was his mother's closest confidant. Alicia had a disturbing influence on the killer from a very young age. She convinced his mother that he needed a strict, almost military form of discipline, and the results were catastrophic. Marquez rubbed his temples, the weight of the case becoming even heavier. The killer's history wasn't just shaped by a toxic home life, it was manipulated and reinforced by Alicia, a figure who seemed to have held sway over every aspect of his life. But what had she done to him? What had she taught him? The detective soon found a disturbing trail of abuse. As a child, the killer, then known as David Ortega, had been subjected to years of severe punishment, both physical and emotional, under the guise of correction by his mother. Alicia had encouraged this, but worse, Alicia had introduced him to the idea that suffering was the key to understanding the world. That pain, both given and received, was a form of purification. The killer's mother had believed that through suffering her son could be cleansed of his flaws. It was a philosophy that was deeply ingrained in him, one that would later become the foundation for his violent actions. Marquez and Lina found documents from the psychologist's past work that described her unorthodox methods. She had been known to encourage violent role-playing exercises, where children were made to act out scenarios of punishment and absolution. Her patients often left feeling confused and disturbed, but none were as deeply affected as David Ortega. By the time he was a teenager, his psyche had been irrevocably altered by years of manipulation and mind games. Alicia had taught him that violence was not just a release, it was a form of justice, a way of righting wrongs. As the investigation continued, the detectives uncovered something chilling. Alicia's influence had not stopped when David reached adulthood. She had continued to play a role in his life. Even after he had become an adult, Alicia had, in a sense, remained a puppet master, pulling the strings of his every action, even after he had left her home and begun to live independently. It was Alicia who had encouraged his darker tendencies, subtly pushing him to exact revenge on those who had hurt him, teaching him to see violence as a necessary part of life. What she did to him, "It's worse than we thought," Lina said quietly, staring at the photos of Alicia from her psychological evaluations. She made him believe he had a purpose, that his pain was something sacred, that he was destined to make the world suffer, to purify it. Marquez felt a knot form in his stomach as the realization began to settle in. The killer's obsession with death, with the twisted art he was creating, was rooted in this warped worldview, one in which death and violence were seen as the only ways to transcend pain, to gain control over the suffering that had defined his life. Alicia had not just been a caretaker, she had been the architect of his nightmare. But just as the detectives began to understand the deep psychological scars left by Alicia, they uncovered something even more disturbing. The mother, the one who had originally subjected David to this horrifying treatment, was still alive, and she was living under a new name, a new identity, completely off the radar. "She's still out there," Marquez whispered, the implications crashing over him. "And if she's anything like Alicia, she might just be pulling the strings of this whole thing." The killer isn't just trying to purify the world. He's trying to finish what was started. Lena turned toward him, her expression hardening. "Then we need to find her. We need to understand how deep this goes." As they closed the file, the weight of their next steps loomed large. The killer's twisted path had started with a toxic, abusive upbringing, but it had been reinforced by a woman who had given him a warped philosophy of life and death. And now, with his mother still alive, they were left with a chilling question. Was the killer's story truly his own, or was it a twisted echo of his past, waiting for the final act to unfold? Chapter 5. The Master of the Game. The discovery of Alicia Moreno's involvement in the killer's past was disturbing enough, but the deeper they dug, the more they realized that she was merely a secondary player in a far larger game. The name that kept resurfacing in the case files was someone even more elusive: Dr. Elena Vargas, a clinical psychologist and former professor at a local university. Dr. Vargas had a reputation for pushing the boundaries of psychological theory, blending elements of radical philosophy with mental health practices. But what made her truly dangerous was the way she manipulated her patients into adopting her beliefs that bordered on the extreme. Lena was the first to make the connection. "Vargas, it's her. She's been pulling the strings all along. She's the one who shaped the killer's view of the world." Her voice was a mixture of disbelief and horror as she leaned over the file on Dr. Vargas. "She's not just a psychologist. She's a philosopher, a dangerous one." Marquez felt the blood drain from his face as he read the notes on Dr. Vargas. She was a brilliant woman, a rising star in the field of psychology, but her methods had always been controversial. Her seminars had attracted a certain type of follower: the disillusioned, the angry, and the lost. Her teachings, often bordering on nihilism, espoused the idea that human suffering was not just inevitable but necessary. According to Vargas, suffering was the only path to true enlightenment, and the world could only be redeemed through acts of profound violence and upheaval. But what was even more chilling was the fact that Dr. Vargas had taken a personal interest in David Ortega when he was just a young teenager. Alicia Moreno, recognizing that her own methods were not enough to control David, had sought out Vargas's expertise, hoping the psychologist could help channel David's violent tendencies into something productive. What followed was years of manipulation, as Vargas taught David that only through destruction could he achieve purity. Only through violence could he rid the world of its inherent evil. Marquez clenched his fists, his mind racing with the implications. It wasn't just about punishing David. She made him believe that violence was necessary, that he was chosen to bring justice. She turned him into a weapon, Lena, a tool of her philosophy. Lena nodded grimly, her face pale. The murders, it's all part of her twisted idea of purging the world. And now, she's become part of his legacy. She's been feeding him this ideology, this justification for every death. Every victim is a step toward completing the cleansing she promised him. The more they uncovered about Dr. Vargas, the more they realized how deeply her influence had permeated every aspect of the killer's life. She had been the one to introduce him to the idea of symbolic justice, of using death as an expression of cosmic order. She had shaped his worldview in a way that made him see murder as sacred, as an act of divine will. But her influence wasn't just intellectual, it was personal. She had been there for every step of his transformation, from the teenager trying to understand his place in the world, to the fully formed killer who believed that his murders were a form of redemption. The investigation took a darker turn when the detectives learned that Dr. Vargas had been in contact with David Ortega recently. The correspondence was covert, hidden in encrypted messages, but it was clear she was still actively guiding him, still instructing him on how to execute the murders. The killings weren't just the work of a madman, they were the work of a disciple, a pupil, completing the teachings of his dark mentor. It was a twisted game of obedience, with Dr. Vargas as the master, pulling the strings from the shadows. Lena and Marquez realized they were running out of time. If they didn't catch Dr. Vargas soon, if they didn't understand her philosophy and her hold over David, they would never be able to stop the cycle of violence. Every murder was a lesson learned, a piece of the puzzle falling into place for David. But there was one problem. Dr. Vargas was elusive. She had vanished, going completely off the grid after the police began to investigate her. But one thing was certain. She wasn't done with David. She hadn't just abandoned him. She had likely instructed him to continue. "We need to find her," Lena said, a dangerous resolve hardening in her voice. "Vargas is the key to stopping this." But finding Vargas wasn't going to be easy. She was more than just a psychologist. She was a master manipulator, a woman who knew how to hide in plain sight, how to make people believe what she wanted them to believe. It was clear now that David was no longer the only threat. The true mastermind was still out there, and if the detectives couldn't catch her in time, the killer's reign of terror would continue, the murders spiraling toward an even darker conclusion. As the investigation pressed on, Marquez couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Every move they made, every piece of information they uncovered, led them closer to a horrifying truth. This was no longer just about catching a killer. This was about stopping a movement of philosophy that had taken root in the mind of a dangerous man, one who believed that death and suffering were the only path to salvation. And unless they found Dr. Vargas soon, the world was going to see just how far her influence had reached. Chapter 6. The Drawing of the End. The discovery of the latest crime scene left the detectives shaken. It wasn't the brutality of the murder that disturbed them. It was the clarity of the message the killer had left behind. The victim, a man named Samuel Fisher, was found in a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of the city, his body suspended in midair by thin wire, his limbs twisted into unnatural positions. His face was obscured by a plastic mask that seemed to smirk at the world, as if mocking the detectives' every attempt to catch him. And, like the others before him, there was a drawing on the wall this time, painted in a deep black substance that wasn't quite blood, but something much thicker, something more sinister. The drawing was unmistakable. It was a distorted image of a man, arms outstretched, bound at the wrists and ankles, with a massive shadow looming over him. The figure in the drawing appeared to be cowering, but there was something familiar about the shape of the shadow, something that made Lena's stomach churn. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a monstrous, looming figure, the mother. Lena felt her heart drop as she examined the drawing, trying to decipher its meaning. "It's her," she muttered under her breath. "It's his mother." The shadow represented the killer's lifelong obsession, the one person who had controlled and tormented him for years. And now it seemed the killer was ready to confront her, to finally exact the ultimate form of vengeance that had been years in the making. Marquez stood in front of the wall, his face pale as he took in the scene. This is the endgame. He's not just killing for justice anymore. This is personal. It's about revenge. It's about her. Lena nodded slowly, her mind racing. The killer's entire existence had been shaped by his mother's abuse, and now, through his twisted philosophy, he had come to see her as the embodiment of all the pain and suffering he had endured. The drawings, the murders, everything had been leading to this point, a final reckoning. The shadow on the wall wasn't just a symbol, it was a promise. The killer was preparing for something catastrophic, something the detectives weren't yet ready to face. The pattern was undeniable. Every murder had been a step toward this confrontation. Each victim had represented a piece of the killer's past, a wrong that needed to be righted, a slight that needed to be avenged. But with this new drawing, it was clear. The final victim would be someone close to him, someone who had played a key role in his twisted upbringing. The killer had been building toward this moment, this ultimate act of revenge, for years. Lena turned to Marquez, her eyes filled with determination. "We need to find her, his mother. If she's still alive, if she's the one he's coming for, then we need to get to her first, before he does." Marquez clenched his jaw, the weight of their responsibility pressing down on him. "We've been chasing shadows all this time. We need to put an end to this now. If he's planning something, it could be the worst murder yet." The detectives worked through the night, tracking down every lead, every scrap of information that could help them find the killer's mother. They scoured hospital records, school files, and old police reports from David's childhood. piecing together a portrait of the woman who had shaped him into the monster he was today. Alicia Moreno had been the first influence, but she had been a puppet in the hands of a far darker force. His mother had been the true architect of David's tragedy, the one who had set him on the path to destruction. As dawn broke, they finally found something a lead on her whereabouts. A distant relative had seen her living in a small apartment under an assumed name. The detectives were hesitant, unsure whether they were prepared for what they might find, but it was clear that the end was near, and they couldn't afford to wait any longer. They had to act. By the time they arrived at the apartment building, the air was thick with tension. The small, run-down complex stood like a forgotten monument to the past. The detectives moved quietly, their steps synchronized. As they approached the door to apartment 3B, they had no idea what they would face inside. But everything they had uncovered so far suggested that this confrontation would be unlike anything they had ever experienced. They were no longer chasing a killer. They were hunting down a force of pure darkness, a woman who had raised her son to be a weapon of destruction. Lena reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling. This was the moment they had been building toward. They were about to confront the source of all the evil that had been unleashed. As she pushed the door open, the silence was deafening, the air heavy with the weight of their discovery. Inside, the apartment was bare, almost clinical in its emptiness. The only sign of life was a single figure sitting in the middle of the room, hunched over. The woman, his mother, was older now, her face lined with years of regret and pain. But there was no mistaking who she was, the shadow from the drawing, the embodiment of all the killer's pain. She looked up slowly as they entered, her eyes empty, like those of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "I knew you would come," she said softly, her voice tinged with an eerie calm. "But you're too late. The game is over now." Lena and Marquez exchanged a look of disbelief. The mother didn't seem surprised to see them. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. This was it. The final act was about to unfold. But would they be able to stop it? Or had they already walked into the killer's ultimate trap? Chapter 7. The final act. The moment Lena and Marquez entered the small, dimly lit apartment, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over them. The mother, sitting perfectly still in the center of the room, did not seem surprised by their arrival. Her face was expressionless, as if she had been waiting for this confrontation all her life. The room was sterile, almost too quiet, with no furniture to speak of, only a single chair, the one she was sitting in, facing the door as if prepared for this final act. Lena stepped forward cautiously, her hand resting on her gun holster. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but laced with tension. The mother did not respond immediately. Her eyes glazed over as if lost in some distant thought. It was as though she hadn't heard the words at all, or perhaps she had no interest in speaking at all. "You're too late," the mother finally said, her voice eerily calm. Her eyes flickered toward Lena and Marquez, but there was no fear in them, only a strange, quiet resignation. "David is already beyond your reach. You can't stop him now. The game has already been played." Marquez frowned, taking a cautious step forward. "Where is he?" His voice was firm, but there was a tremor in his chest, a sense of urgency he couldn't quite suppress. "Where is David? He's already killed. He's leaving these drawings, leading us here, to you." "What does it all mean?" The mother smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was cold, distant knowing. "You don't understand, do you? You still think you're the ones in control of this game. You're not. You never were." She paused, as if savoring the moment. "David was never trying to run from you. He was trying to make you see, to make you understand. Every death, every drawing, everything he's done was to bring you to this very moment, this final act." Lena's heart began to race. She glanced at Marquez, whose jaw was clenched tightly. "What are you talking about?" Lena demanded, her voice tightening with suspicion. "What does he want? What's this final act?" The mother's gaze hardened, and she stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. "This isn't just about revenge. It's about purification. David is cleansing the world, starting with the ones who created him. You think I'm the one to blame for everything he's become, but you're wrong. You all are. And now, you'll be a part of his final judgment." Suddenly, the truth hit them like a sledgehammer. It wasn't just about the killer's mother. It wasn't even about Alicia's influence. This was something far more ritualistic, more cosmic than they had ever imagined. The killer David had been orchestrating his murders as part of a larger apocalyptic vision of cleansing the world of its sins. And now, with the mother as the final key to his plan, everything was coming to a head. Lena felt her stomach tighten. She understood now that David's murders had never been random. They had all been carefully chosen, each victim representing something the killer felt needed to be purged from the world. The final act was to come, and it was clear that David had already calculated every move. He had been waiting for this moment, for the detectives to find his mother so that he could complete his cleansing. As if on cue, a low, distorted sound echoed from the hallway outside the apartment. It was almost imperceptible at first, but the tension in the room thickened and the mother's smile deepened. "He's here," she whispered, as if the words themselves were part of the ritual. "You were never meant to stop him. He's chosen this path, and now you're the final pieces of the puzzle." Marquez's instincts flared, and he quickly grabbed Lena's arm, pulling her toward the door. They could hear the distant sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. "Get ready," he hissed. "He's coming. We need to move now." The mother made no move to stop them, instead standing silently by the window as the detectives rushed toward the door. But as they opened it, the full scope of David's plan began to crystallize. There, in the hallway, standing just outside the apartment door, was David Ortega himself, calm, composed, and almost serene, as if the murders he had committed had all been part of some grand, elegant scheme. He smiled when he saw them, the same cold, terrifying smile he had worn in every police sketch, every photograph, the smile of a man who had been in control this entire time, even when the detectives had thought they were the ones hunting him. David's eyes locked onto Lena's with a predatory gleam. "This is the end," David said softly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had accepted his fate long ago. "The purification is nearly complete. I have only one more thing to do." Before they could react, David pulled something from the folds of his jacket, a long, thin knife, gleaming with cold precision. The detectives froze, their hearts racing, but there was no immediate violence. Instead, David held the knife up, almost reverently, as if admiring it before the final plunge. "You think I'm the monster?" he said almost conversationally. "But you don't understand. This is justice. This is the only way the world can be saved." He took a step forward, and the sound of his footsteps echoed like a drumbeat, each one sealing their fate. Lena's voice trembled as she drew her weapon, her finger on the trigger. "David, stop. It's over. You don't have to do this." David's smile never wavered. It was never about stopping. It was about making you see. This is the only way. The game is almost over. As David took another step closer, the silence in the hallway felt suffocating. Lena's mind raced, her hands gripping the gun tighter, but deep down, she knew something far more terrifying. They weren't just up against a killer. They were facing a man who had been consumed by his own ideology, an ideology so deep and so twisted that it had turned him into something far more monstrous than they had ever prepared for. The final act was unfolding, and the only question left was, who would be left standing when it was all over? Chapter 8. The Night of Judgment. David's eyes gleamed with a quiet, unnerving certainty as he advanced toward Lena and Marquez, the blade of his knife catching the dim light of the hallway. The sound of his footsteps echoed like a death knell, rhythmic and deliberate, the slow march of someone who had already accepted the inevitable. For a brief moment, it felt as though time itself had frozen, the world narrowing to the two of them and this man, this killer, who saw himself as a judge, a purveyor of salvation. Lena's heart thudded in her chest as she held her gun steady. Every instinct told her to fire, but something about David's calmness, his detachment, kept her from pulling the trigger. He was too calm. The air felt thick with dread, and for a moment, she wondered if they were simply pawns in his game, as he had said. She tried to steady her breath, her grip tightening on the cold steel of her weapon, but her mind raced, thinking back to all the drawings, the victims, the twisted logic behind each one of his murders. There was no doubt now this was no ordinary killer. This was a man consumed by his own delusions, a man who had killed not for power, but for a sense of purpose. Marquez shifted slightly, his eyes scanning the hallway for any sign of an escape route. But there was nothing. Just David, and the suffocating feeling that this was the end. "David," Marquez said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "We can stop this. You don't have to do this. Let us help you." David chuckled softly, a low, almost mocking sound that sent a shiver down Lena's spine. "Help me? You think I need your help?" His voice was filled with contempt, and he took another step forward. "I don't need anyone's help. I've seen the truth. And now, I'm the one who decides who lives and who dies. I'm the one who brings order to all this chaos." His words hung in the air like a curse, the twisted logic of a man who had become so wrapped up in his own delusions that he no longer saw the world for what it truly was. It was also clear to him his murders were necessary, each one a sacrifice on the altar of some grand, distorted vision of justice. He believed that in eradicating the corrupt, the sinful, he was purging the world for a greater good. But to Lena and Marquez, the truth was painfully clear. There was no redemption in David's actions. There was only madness. "We can stop the killings," Lena said, her voice steady now, desperate. "David, please, you don't have to do this. Whatever you think you're doing, it's not justice. You're just hurting people." David's smile faded, and for the first time, a flicker of something dark passed through his eyes. He raised the knife slowly, the gleaming blade reflecting the harsh light. "You don't get it, do you?" His voice was quieter now, almost a whisper, but there was a weight to it that made the air feel colder. "I'm doing what no one else could. I'm making the world right again. You don't see the corruption, the evil, but I do. I've been given this gift, the ability to see through the veil of lies. I'm the only one who knows the truth." Lena and Marquez exchanged a glance. The killer was beyond reasoning. There was no convincing him that what he was doing was wrong. The trap had been set long ago, and now they were simply walking into the final act of a tragedy that had been building for years. As much as they wanted to believe they could save him, the truth was that David had made his choice. And now, they were caught in the crossfire of a delusion so deeply ingrained that no amount of pleading could undo the damage. Suddenly, a shrill voice cut through the tension, a scream, raw and desperate. It echoed from behind them, and for a moment, Lena and Marquez turned instinctively toward the sound. The scream came from the end of the hall, the entrance to the stairwell where they had left the mother. Panic flared in Lena's chest. "No, don't!" she shouted. But the scream was already fading into silence. David's gaze snapped to Lena, a predatory glint in his eyes. "You're too late," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "The final act has already begun. You can't stop what's already in motion." Lena's heart pounded in her chest. In that moment, she realized the truth. David had been leading them into a trap all along. The murders, the drawings, the sick philosophy, it had all been a part of a greater plan to bring them here, to this moment, and they had walked right into it. Before Lena could react, David lunged forward, moving with a speed that shocked her. The knife was a blur in his hand, and instinctively, she raised her gun. The sound of the shot rang out, but David was already too close. The blade was at her throat before she could even blink, the cold steel pressing against her skin, and for a split second, everything seemed to slow down. But the bullet had found its mark. David's eyes widened, his body going limp as he stumbled backward, the knife slipping from his hand and clattering to the ground. Lena's shot had struck him in the shoulder, just deep enough to incapacitate him. He collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, his face twisted in pain and confusion. The eerie calm that had surrounded him was shattered in an instant, replaced by the raw vulnerability of someone who had finally been brought down. Marquez rushed forward, grabbing David's arms and pinning him to the ground. "It's over," he said, his voice low, as if trying to convince himself. "You've lost." David's eyes flickered, then locked onto Lena's. For a moment, it was as if the killer was looking past her, as though he could see something that no one else could. Then, with a strangled gasp, he whispered one last chilling sentence. "You can't stop the end," he said, his voice barely audible. "The game is still in play." Lena felt the air around her grow cold. She had stopped David Ortega, the murderer, the madman who had been terrorizing the city for so long. But something inside her told her that this wasn't the end, not yet. There was still one more chapter to this dark tale, and she feared that no matter what they did, the game was far from over. Chapter 9. The fall of the artist David Ortega lay in a pool of his own blood, still gasping for breath, as Lena stood over him, her weapon still raised. The room felt suffocatingly quiet now, the tension that had gripped them all during the confrontation slowly dissipating, replaced by the heavy realization of what had just happened. They had stopped him, he was no longer a threat, or so it seemed. Marquez crouched down beside David, his face grim. He reached for the killer's pulse, but there was none. It was over. David Ortega was dead. The city was safe. But as Lena lowered her gun, her eyes fell on the floor beside the fallen killer. There, etched in blood, was one final drawing. It was a crude, hurried sketch, but it was unmistakable, the same shadowy figure, the same distorted man with outstretched arms, bound and helpless. But this time, the face of the man was obscured, replaced by a skull with a twisted grin. Lena stepped forward, unable to tear her eyes away from the horrifying image. "He knew," she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "He knew it was going to end like this." Marquez didn't answer right away. He stood, his eyes flickering between David's body and the drawing. "It's not over," he said quietly, his voice filled with unease. "He's been planning this all along. He wanted us to find him, to confront him. But that's not the worst part." Lena looked at him, her mind spinning. "What are you talking about?" Marquez stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the drawing. "This isn't just a prediction. This is a message." His finger traced the edges of the drawing on the floor. "He's telling us something. He's showing us who the next victim is, and it's someone close." Lena's stomach churned. She stepped back, her mind racing. "What do you mean? Who?" The realization hit her with the force of a blow. David had never intended for this to end with his death. His twisted game wasn't just about revenge. It was about passing on a legacy, an artistic creation, a macabre masterpiece that would live on even after he was gone. The drawings had never been just part of his crimes. They had been the key to his plan all along. Marquez's voice broke through her thoughts. The final piece of the puzzle. His mother was just the beginning. The real end is yet to come. Lena's heart raced. She turned to look at David again, at his lifeless body, and for the first time, she felt a deep sense of dread settle in her bones. This wasn't just the work of a single psychopath. It was the work of someone who had planned their own death, had prepared for it, knowing it would only complete the cycle. He had been a part of something darker, something that would outlive him. They moved quickly, searching through David's apartment for anything that might offer them more clues. It didn't take long before they found what they were looking for hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of the room, a stack of journals. Lena flipped through them frantically, her eyes scanning the pages filled with bizarre sketches and nonsensical ramblings. There was no mistaking it. David had seen himself as the final act in a ritual, one that would culminate with someone else taking his place. The drawings, the victims, the calculated brutality, all of it had been to groom someone else to carry on his legacy. The most chilling revelation came in the form of a final entry, scrawled in messy handwriting. "The true artist will come after me. You will recognize him by his shadow, by the smile that haunts the dark. He will take the blade from my hand, and the game will begin anew." Lena's blood ran cold as she closed the journal, her hands trembling. "He wasn't the last one," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was preparing someone who would carry out his work." Marquez shook his head in disbelief. Who could possibly continue this madness? Who would follow him? Before Lena could answer, a voice crackled over the radio at her side. "Detective, it was the officer from the scene. You need to come back. You're going to want to see this." Lena and Marquez exchanged a glance. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight. It's his mother," the officer replied, hesitation in his voice. "She's gone. The apartment is empty. There's no sign of a struggle, but it's like she vanished." Lena's mind raced. The killer's mother had been their last lead, their final piece of the puzzle. If she was gone now, it could only mean one thing. The cycle David had created, the game he had designed, was continuing. And the true artist, the one who would carry his legacy forward, was already in motion. Without another word, Lena and Marquez rushed out of the apartment, back to their car, and sped toward the mother's last known location. They could feel it now, the sense of something darker, something even more dangerous, looming just ahead. This wasn't just about solving a case anymore. It was about stopping a ritual, one that had been set into motion long before David's death. As they arrived at the building, Lena's heart sank. The police tape that had been placed around the entrance was now torn, ripped apart, as though someone had been in a hurry. The door was ajar, and the faint sound of something off drifted from within. The building was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. They entered cautiously, guns drawn, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. They reached the apartment door, and Lena took a deep breath before pushing it open. The room inside was eerily still, just as it had been when they'd last visited. But this time, there was a difference. The walls, once bare, were now covered in drawings like the ones David had left behind. But this time, they weren't the product of a tortured mind. They were the work of an artist. Lena's pulse quickened as she stepped further into the room. The final drawing was in the center of the wall, two figures, one with a mask, the other with a distorted, smiling face. Both were holding knives, and above them, the words were written, "The game begins anew." Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to Marquez. "It's not over," she said, her voice heavy with dread. "It's just beginning." The Man of 1,000 Masks. Chapter 1. The First Face. It was a bitterly cold night, the kind where the air feels like it's cutting through your skin. The city of Santa Teresa, usually buzzing with activity, now lay in a heavy fog that cloaked its streets and buildings like a funeral shroud. A silence had settled over the city, thick and oppressive, as if it were holding its breath. In the heart of the mist, an abandoned warehouse stood, its windows shattered and its door half ajar, a place where only the desperate and the dangerous would gather. And tonight, it was where a body would be discovered. Detectives Roberto Fernandez and Laura Rivas arrived at the scene shortly after the call came in. They had been working a string of drug-related crimes in the city, but nothing had prepared them for this. The warehouse was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic far outside, muffled by the fog. Inside, the flickering of a single overhead light cast long shadows across the space. The body of Jorge Salazar lay on the floor, his arms outstretched in a pose of resignation, his face completely obscured by a mask. At first glance, it was clear that this wasn't just another gang-related murder. Salazar, known for his ties to the underworld, was no stranger to violence, but something about his death felt wrong. The mask on his face was what caught the detective's attention. It was no ordinary mask. It was a grotesque clown mask, its painted features warped into a twisted caricature. The eyes were unnaturally wide. The smile stretched far beyond the realms of normalcy. It was a face of mockery, of cruelty, as if it were laughing at the very idea of death. Laura crouched beside the body, her eyes narrowing as she took in the details. This is deliberate," she muttered, almost to herself. "It's not just the crime, it's a message. But what is it saying?" She ran her gloved fingers over the edge of the mask, feeling the cold, cracked surface. It was old, worn far older than it should have been for someone like Salazar. It was as if the mask had a history of its own, a story that the killer had chosen to share, but one that Laura couldn't yet understand. Roberto, meanwhile, was already walking around the room, observing the surroundings. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle. The floor was spotless, save for a few drops of blood leading up to Salazar's body. The rest of the warehouse appeared to have been undisturbed. It was as though the killer had planned this with surgical precision. Everything was set, everything was in place, but the reason behind the mask, behind the manner of the killing, eluded them. "The clown," Roberto said quietly, his voice almost reverent. "Why a clown? What does that tell us about Salazar? Or about the killer?" He was trying to make sense of it. In his years as a detective, he had seen many types of murder, but this felt different, too personal, too symbolic. He knew the mask wasn't a coincidence. It was the key to understanding the crime. But it was a key that seemed locked in a box that no one could open. Laura stood up and walked around the body, her eyes scanning the room for anything they might have missed. She glanced at Roberto. "It's almost as if the killer is telling us a story, but one we're not ready to hear. She shuddered involuntarily, though she tried to mask it. It's like he's using the mask as a way to make Salazar more than just a victim. He's making him a symbol. But of what? After a moment of silence, Roberto turned to the forensic team, who were busy taking their own measurements and photographs. Make sure to check the mask thoroughly, he instructed. There's something about it, something we're not seeing yet. As the forensic experts worked, Roberto felt the weight of the case settle over him. There was something disturbingly methodical about the whole thing. It wasn't just murder, it was performance. A carefully orchestrated act that had meaning beyond the crime itself. As they transported Salazar's body to the morgue, the detectives continued to discuss the case, but the mystery of the mask hung heavily in the air between them. They could feel the beginning of something larger, something darker, unfolding, but they couldn't yet grasp its shape. Laura was quiet for a long time, her mind racing through all the possibilities. The mask, it wasn't just a disguise. It was a reflection of Salazar's life, perhaps, of something hidden deep inside him that the killer wanted to expose. But what? The autopsy results came the next morning. Salazar's cause of death was a single, precise stab wound to the chest. There were no defensive wounds, no sign of a struggle. It was clear that the killer had known Salazar, had caught him by surprise, or perhaps had even been invited in. There was no indication of robbery or anything else that might explain the murder in typical terms. It wasn't just about killing Salazar. It was about making him a part of something greater. Salazar wasn't just murdered, Laura said as they reviewed the report. He was chosen, carefully. The mask wasn't just a prop, it was a symbol. She paused, then added with growing unease, I think the killer is trying to reveal something. Something about Salazar's life. Something he's ashamed of. Roberto looked at her, realization dawning. This isn't just about Salazar. The killer's sending us a message about him, about his sins, and the mask is the clue. It's the reflection of who Salazar really was. He paused, his fingers tapping the desk as he thought. But why a clown? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as the detectives stared at the photos of Salazar's body, now carefully laid out in the morgue. It was only the beginning of a long, twisted puzzle, one that would soon involve far more than just a single victim. They were about to enter a world where every death had a story, every mask had a meaning, and the line between predator and prey would blur in ways they could never imagine. Chapter 2. The Mask of Sin. The next victim was found in a high-end apartment on the outskirts of Santa Teresa, the city's wealthier district, with its gleaming glass buildings and pristine streets, felt worlds apart from the grimy warehouses and back alleys that were more familiar to the detectives. This murder was different. The victim was not part of the criminal underworld. Clara Morales, a well-known socialite, had no ties to the type of people who usually ended up on the wrong side of a crime scene. She was known for her charity work, her glamorous lifestyle, and her perfect social circle. But the mask, another clue, told a different story. Clara's body was found in her living room, sprawled on the floor, her eyes wide open in frozen terror. The scene itself was almost too perfect, as if arranged for maximum shock value. Clara's lifeless body was draped in an expensive gown, and around her neck hung a necklace with diamonds that glittered even in the dim light of the apartment. Yet the most disturbing detail was the mask she wore, an intricate golden mask of a woman. It was adorned with elaborate feathers and jewels, its expression serene, almost angelic, but the eyes were hollow, black, as if they had seen something far darker than the beauty that surrounded her. Roberto and Laura arrived at the scene as soon as the call came in. The apartment was immaculate, every piece of furniture arranged in perfect order, every surface gleaming. Clara's death didn't fit the profile of a typical murder. There was no sign of forced entry, no obvious struggle. It was as though someone had entered her home with calm precision, like an old friend or confidant. And then, just as with Salazar, the mask was left as a twisted signature of the killer's intentions. The same as before, Laura remarked, her voice tight with frustration as she surveyed the apartment. The mask, it's a message. But what's it saying? She stepped closer to Clara's body, her gloved hands hovering over the mask. It's not just decoration. This is symbolic. I can feel it. Roberto looked down at the body, his brow furrowing as he took in the mask. A golden mask, but with hollow eyes. he muttered, almost to himself. It's showing us that Clara's life, her image, was nothing more than an illusion. He stepped back and took a deep breath. But why her? What is the killer trying to say? Laura was already looking through the apartment, her eyes scanning every detail. She found a drawer in the living room that was half open, filled with letters and documents. As she rifled through them, one paper caught her attention, a handwritten letter, dated a week before her death. It was addressed to Clara from a person only identified as G. The letter was short, cryptic, and seemed to contain a message meant to unsettle her. It read, "Your sins are not forgotten, Clara. The eyes of truth see everything. Your time is coming. The mask will reveal your true face." Roberto joined her, glancing over her shoulder at the letter. "Gee, that's interesting. A name? Or just a letter? Is this the killer trying to taunt her? Or is this someone from her past?" He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "Whoever it is, they want us to know that there's more to Clara's life than meets the eye." The forensics team arrived shortly after, and they began their work on the scene, dusting for fingerprints, collecting hair samples, and examining the mask itself. It was clear that the mask had been placed with care, positioned just so, as if it were meant to represent something much deeper than a simple disguise. Laura could feel her frustration building. The killer wasn't just murdering people. He was turning them into his art, each victim becoming a piece in his grotesque puzzle. Over the next few days, the detectives dug deeper into Clara's life, searching for any possible connection between her and the killer. They learned that Clara had been involved in a long-term affair with a wealthy businessman named Alejandro Cortez. Their relationship had been the subject of many whispered rumors, particularly regarding the mysterious nature of their meetings. But what troubled Laura the most was a pattern she began to notice. Every victim, including Salazar, seemed to have some hidden sin, some dark secret buried deep in their lives. And now Clara, seemingly perfect, was also carrying a hidden past. The more they uncovered about Clara, the more the case began to make sense. It wasn't just her affair. Clara had been involved in a series of shady financial dealings, funneling money from her charitable organizations into accounts that led to nowhere. The angelic mask, with its hollow eyes, now felt like a cruel mockery. It was as if the killer had exposed her, showing the world her true face, the face of a woman who had spent her life pretending to be something she was not. "It's not just about killing them," Laura said quietly, as she and Roberto sat in the police station, going through the files late into the night. "The killer is making them face their own sins. The mask is the key to understanding their guilt. It's not just about the murder, it's about judgment." Roberto nodded slowly. "Each victim is being judged. It's almost as if the killer is playing God, taking it upon himself to expose their darkest secrets, to reveal their true selves. Salazar's mask was a joke, a cruel representation of his life, and Clara's mask? It's the same thing, a false image shattered by the truth. But where do we go from here?" The case was quickly becoming something they hadn't expected, a personal challenge. The killer wasn't just playing with the lives of his victims, he was toying with the detectives too. Each murder felt like a message, a piece of a puzzle that seemed to be constantly shifting. And as they looked at the golden mask that had been left behind with Clara, they knew one thing for sure: the killer wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Chapter 3. Masks of the Past. The third victim was found on a quiet street, nestled between two old buildings, where the city seemed to hold onto its forgotten memories. The location was nondescript, a place most people wouldn't even notice, but the body was hard to ignore. It belonged to Luis Mercado, a former police officer with a tarnished reputation. Luis had been fired years ago for his involvement in a botched drug operation, and since then he had faded into obscurity, living off small-time jobs and avoiding the spotlight. But the mask he wore was unmistakable, a red and black demon's face. Its mouth curled into a sinister grin, the kind of mask you would expect in an old horror film. Yet this wasn't a scene from a movie. This was real, and the implications were starting to sink in for the detectives. Laura stood over the body, her stomach churning. "Another mask," she said softly, her eyes scanning the scene for any clues. Another victim. This time there were no jewels, No fancy surroundings, just an old street lamp casting a long shadow over Mercado's lifeless form. The mask, like the others, seemed carefully chosen, tailored to fit the nature of the victim's life. The demon's face, with its sharp features and exaggerated expression, seemed to mock Luis's own fall from grace. Roberto had been quiet, his gaze lingering on the mask. It was beginning to eat at him. The symbolism behind each death, each mask, was too deliberate to ignore. Luis Mercado had fallen from the force years ago, and in many ways he had been forgotten. But the killer hadn't forgotten him. The mask seemed to be a symbol of his past, a reminder of his moral failings. "It's like the killer's going after people who can't escape their past," Roberto said, voice low. "People who have something they're hiding, something they can't outrun." Laura nodded grimly. Luis Mercado was a disgrace to the badge, the demon mask. It's fitting. A fallen officer, corrupted by greed and bad decisions. He had a lot of enemies. She knelt down beside the body, noting that the scene was clean, no signs of struggle, no forced entry. Luis had died quickly, silently, as if he had expected it. It was the same pattern they had seen with Salazar and Clara. No one fought back. No one even tried to run. It was as if they were all waiting for the inevitable, accepting their fate without resistance. Roberto's mind began to race. There was a connection between the victims that wasn't immediately obvious. The first two had been chosen for their sins, Salazar's greed, Clara's deception, but what about Luis? His sin wasn't one of luxury or appearance. It was one of duty and betrayal. His fall from grace had been a result of his own corruption, of betraying the badge he had sworn to uphold. And now, the killer had come for him, as he had for the others, making him face the consequences of his actions. The things he had hidden in the dark. The masks, Laura murmured, pulling out a notebook. We have to start looking at them more closely. Each one is a reflection of their victim, but we're not seeing it until it's too late. She flipped through the pages, her mind working over the patterns they had begun to see. Each mask represented something deeply personal about the person it was placed on. The killer wasn't just choosing them randomly. He was selecting them with precision, each one reflecting a dark truth about the victim's life. They spent the next few days diving into Luis's history. It wasn't pretty. As a cop, he had been involved in shady dealings with the criminal underworld, taking bribes and turning a blind eye to the drug trade. His fall from grace had been swift, a public scandal that had destroyed his career and reputation. But there was one detail that kept bothering Laura. Luis's final months had been filled with paranoia. He had gone underground, moving from place to place, always looking over his shoulder. Someone, he had believed, was watching him. And maybe, just maybe, that someone had been the killer. The more they dug into the lives of the victims, the clearer the pattern became. The killer wasn't simply targeting people who had done bad things. He was going after those who had been forced to confront the worst parts of themselves. Luis had never fully reckoned with the corruption in his past, and Clara had never faced the consequences of her lies. Salazar, too, had lived a life of excess, never pausing to think about the people he had destroyed along the way. The killer was making them all face their sins. He was turning their pasts into something inescapable. The masks represent their guilt, Laura said one night, as they sat in their office poring over the details of the case. Each one is a mirror of their worst self, and the killer is showing them who they really are, whether they like it or not. She leaned back in her chair, exhausted but determined. But the question remains, who is the killer? Who is doing this and why? Roberto rubbed his temples, trying to focus. The masks are telling us a story. Salazar, Clara, Luis. Their sins are linked, but so is the killer. Whoever he is, he's not just killing for revenge. He's playing a game, one that's about exposing the truth. But why? What's the end goal? That was the question that haunted them both. As they looked at the images of the victims, the masks, the carefully orchestrated scenes of death, one thing was clear. The killer was making a statement. But what was he trying to say? And, more importantly, when would he come for them? Chapter 4. The Game of Identity. The fourth victim was found early on a Saturday morning, the kind of morning that felt deceptively calm. But the peace of the day was shattered by the discovery of a body in an old abandoned theater at the edge of the city. This time, the victim was someone the detectives had never expected. a former colleague of Laura's, Detective Javier Garcia. Javier had been with the department for over 15 years, known for his quick thinking and sharp instincts. His death, unlike the others, felt like a punch to the gut, personal and deliberate. And the mask. This time it was different, more intricate than before. A porcelain face, cracked along the edges with an expression of agony frozen in time. Laura stood outside the theater, her stomach heavy with dread. Javier's death hit her harder than the others. They had worked together for years, shared cases, and had even joked about retiring together someday. Now, that future was gone. "He didn't deserve this," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as she stared at the theater's decaying facade. It had been years since it had hosted a show, and now it was the scene of a twisted performance of its own. The killer was sending a message, and this time, it felt too close to home. Roberto approached her slowly, his face grim. "It's not just that he's one of ours," he said quietly. "It's the way he was killed. Javier was no criminal. He was a dedicated cop. So why him? What's the connection?" He scanned the area, the weight of the case pressing down on him. The killer had raised the stakes. By targeting one of their own, he had escalated the game to an entirely new level. This wasn't just about exposing the sins of criminals or socialites, it was personal. Inside the theater, Javier's body lay under the stage lights, as if he were part of some sickening performance. His hands were tied behind his back, and the porcelain mask had been placed delicately over his face. But the mask was different from the others. It wasn't a reflection of Javier's sins, but rather a symbol of his forced submission, a mask that covered his identity entirely. Javier's own identity had been taken away, just as he had taken the lives of criminals, without ever fully confronting the darkness in his past. "Whoever did this, they're not just killing to kill," Laura said, kneeling beside the body. "They're taking something from these people. It's not just their lives, they're stealing their identity, their dignity." She looked up at Roberto, her eyes sharp with the realization. "Javier, he was one of the good ones. But this is a direct message to us, to the department. It's almost like the killer is showing us that no one is safe. We're all vulnerable." Roberto nodded, his face darkening. "We've been playing by his rules all along, trying to understand his motives, his patterns. But now it's clear. He's trying to break us. By targeting someone we trust, someone we know, he's testing our resolve." He stepped closer to Javier's body, his mind racing with the implications. The masks, they're not just a way to expose the victim's sins. They're about destroying their identity. And by taking Javier, the killer's telling us, even we're not untouchable. The more they examined Javier's body, the more they realized how meticulously the killer had planned this. There were no signs of a struggle, just like the previous victims. Javier had been caught off guard, his death swift and calculated. The porcelain mask, cracked at the edges, was a stark contrast to the rawness of his life, something that had been beautiful once, now shattered and broken. It was as if the killer had stolen his ability to be who he truly was, just as Javier had done to so many others during his career. For days, the department was on edge. Javier's murder was a cold reminder that they weren't just chasing a criminal anymore. They were caught in a twisted game. The killer was playing with them, forcing them to confront not just the darkness of their victims, but their own vulnerabilities as well. And the masks. They were his weapons, his symbols of power. By stealing the identities of the victims, he was forcing them into a corner, showing them their darkest selves, and making them wear it for the world to see. Roberto and Laura knew they had to find the killer, but they were running out of leads. The more they investigated, the more they realized that they were only scratching the surface of a much deeper web. Every victim, every mask, had its own story, but they were all connected by a single thread: the killer's need to expose the truth. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a judge, a prosecutor, and an executioner, all wrapped into one, and now he had their attention. The department worked around the clock, poring over evidence, searching for connections between the victims. They found that Javier had been involved in an old case, one that had been dismissed years ago. It was a cold case, a messy one, but it seemed that Javier had once investigated a series of strange disappearances, victims who had been connected by a single thread. They all wore masks, and they all had secrets that no one ever uncovered. The case had been buried, but the killer was now bringing it to light, forcing the detectives to confront their own failures. Javier was involved in this case, Laura said one night as she scanned through the old file. He didn't finish it, but maybe the killer is trying to make him finish it now. Maybe he's showing us that this case was never truly closed. It's all connected. She stood up abruptly, her mind racing. The masks, the disappearances, the hidden sins. Maybe Javier knew something, and that's why he was chosen. This wasn't just about his past as a cop. This was about a deeper connection to the killer. As the realization sank in, the detectives knew that the killer had been orchestrating this game for much longer than they had imagined. The stakes had risen. It wasn't just about exposing the sins of the victims anymore. It was about exposing the truth about themselves, their own failings, their own mistakes. The game had become a mirror, and every move the killer made was forcing them to face the darkest corners of their own souls. Chapter 5. The Killer's Family. As the case progressed, the pressure weighed heavier on the detectives. The killings were escalating, each one more personal than the last. But it wasn't just the violence or the cunning of the killer that bothered them. It was the growing suspicion that someone in the department, someone close to them, might be hiding the truth. The killer wasn't just targeting random people anymore. He was forcing the department, and especially Laura, to confront something darker, a secret buried too deep to ignore. It was late one evening when Laura received the call that made her blood run cold. Her heart sank as she heard the voice on the other end of the line, the familiar tone of her younger brother, Daniel. "Laura, you need to come to the house," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't know how to explain this, but I think I've found something bad." Laura's mind raced. She knew instantly that whatever it wasn't good. The last time she had seen her brother was months ago, and she'd always kept her distance, worried about his ties to some questionable people. She hung up the phone, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and dread. She couldn't place why Daniel's call felt like a sudden unraveling, but she knew that the feeling in her gut wasn't just fear, it was certainty. Something about her brother had always felt off, even before all of this began. He had a history, a past he'd tried to keep buried, and somehow she felt that the killer had found it. She rushed out of her apartment, not even bothering to tell Roberto where she was going. This was personal. Her family was involved now, and everything was about to change. When Laura arrived at her childhood home, the door was wide open, a chill creeping in from the night air. She stepped inside, calling out Daniel's name. The house, once full of warmth and laughter, now felt empty, cold, like something had been taken from it. The faint smell of stale cigarettes lingered in the air. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, his face pale, his hands trembling as he clutched a series of photographs. He looked up at Laura, his eyes wide with fear. "I never thought it would come to this," he whispered. "I didn't think it was real." Laura moved closer, her eyes scanning the photographs. At first, they looked like ordinary pictures, shots of people, some with their faces hidden or obscured by shadows. But as she focused more, she realized what they were. These were the victims. The same people she and Roberto had been investigating, the ones whose deaths had sent shockwaves through the city. And there, in the corner of each photo, was the unmistakable signature of the killer, a mask. Each image, a scene from the victim's last moments, captured by someone who had been there. The horror of it crashed over Laura in an instant. "Who did this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Daniel hesitated, then slid another photograph across the table. It was a close-up of a mask different from the ones seen before. It was smaller, simpler, a single tear etched into its surface. It was eerily familiar. Laura froze, her blood running cold as she realized something. This is from the same set of masks, isn't it?" Her mind was racing. The connection was too clear. The mask was linked to the killer, but it was also linked to someone closer, someone she knew. Daniel looked down at the photo, his voice cracking. "It's not just the photos, Laura. I've been doing some digging, and I found out something that makes all of this even worse. The man in the photo," he paused, his breath hitching. "He's connected to our family. He's our father." Laura stared at him in disbelief. What? Her father, a man who had disappeared from their lives years ago, had left without a trace. He had been a cold, distant figure in their family, never showing up to birthday parties, never speaking about his work. He had simply walked out one day, without explanation, and never looked back. Now, Daniel was telling her that the killer was somehow linked to him. It didn't make sense. She had always believed her father was just another ghost in their past, a non-entity who had abandoned them. But now, that past was bleeding into the present, and the killer was making sure they couldn't escape it. Laura's mind was spinning, trying to piece together the fragments of this nightmare. "Are you telling me our father is the killer?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The idea was too absurd, too impossible to comprehend. But Daniel's silence spoke louder than words. "How do you know this?" she demanded, leaning closer to him, desperate for answers. Daniel's face contorted with guilt. I saw him a few weeks ago. I didn't know what to think. But then I started following him, doing some checking around. And I found out that he's been involved in some strange things that connect him to all the victims. I found his name on old records, tied to some missing persons cases. He's not just some old man, Laura. He's part of this. He's part of everything that's happening." Laura felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her father was involved in the deaths of these people. She didn't know if she could process it. He had disappeared years ago, leaving them both with nothing but unanswered questions. And now, it seemed that the killer had been lurking in the shadows all along, manipulating everything, pulling strings from afar. The realization was like a punch to the gut. If her father was involved, if he was the killer, then they were all trapped in a deadly game that had been playing out for years. The case had taken a terrifying turn. What had started as a hunt for a faceless killer was now a twisted web of family secrets, betrayals, and murder. Laura felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest. She was no longer just a detective. She was a daughter, confronting the darkest truth about her own blood. She had to face it. Her father wasn't just a figure from the past. He was a part of the nightmare, a shadow that had followed them all these years. "I have to go after him," Laura said, her voice steely with resolve. "I have to stop him." But deep down, she knew that stopping him might mean unraveling everything she thought she knew about her own life, and that was a price she wasn't sure she was ready to pay. Chapter 6. The Killer's Face. The weeks that followed Daniel's revelation weighed heavily on Laura. The case had become more than just a search for a murderer. It was now a race against time to uncover the truth about her father, and to stop him before he claimed another life. Every step forward felt like a step into darkness. The evidence was there, but it didn't make sense. Her father, the man who had disappeared without a trace, now seemed to be at the center of everything. Yet the deeper they dug, the more elusive the truth became. Every lead felt like a false trail, every answer only leading to more questions. The killer wasn't just a person, they were a shadow that refused to reveal itself. The team worked tirelessly, reviewing old case files, connecting dots that seemed unrelated. But the killer's pattern, though disturbingly methodical, was starting to feel almost too perfect, as if it were tailored to reveal a specific truth. Each victim had their sins exposed in the form of a mask. The killer's growing confidence in his ability to stay hidden was mirrored by the increasing complexity of his murders. And the more personal it became, the closer Laura felt to losing herself in the chaos. Her father, her family, it all seemed so impossible, yet so undeniable. One night, as Laura sat in her cramped office, sifting through the evidence, Roberto entered with a grim look on his face. He held a small envelope in his hand, and Laura knew, without asking, that it wasn't good news. "I think it's time we stopped looking at the killer as someone from the outside," Roberto said, his voice low, the weight of the situation settling in. "We've been chasing shadows, but I think the killer's closer than we realize. He's been toying with us from the beginning." Laura's stomach twisted. "What are you saying?" Roberto handed her the envelope. "This arrived today. It's from the killer." Inside there was no note, no cryptic message, just a single black and white photograph. The image was of Laura's father, taken years ago, a time when he had still been present in their lives. But it wasn't just any photograph. Her father was standing next to a man she didn't recognize, their expressions solemn. The man was holding a mask, an identical match to the one worn by the third victim, Luis Mercado, the one with the red and black demon face. Laura's heart pounded in her chest. The implication was clear. The killer had known her father. In fact, He seemed to have known everyone involved, and now the truth was starting to surface, piece by painful piece. But this photograph raised a new question. Who was the man standing next to her father? Why was he in this photo, and how did he connect to the victims? We need to find this man, Laura said, her voice shaking with urgency. Whoever he is, he's the key to everything. She looked up at Roberto, her eyes hardening with resolve. The killer's been sending us these masks for a reason. He's making sure we see the connection. We're chasing him, but maybe he's been leading us all along. The next few days were a blur of frantic investigation. They tracked down the man in the photograph, a name that led them to a string of mysterious connections. The man, Emilio Perez, had disappeared years ago, much like Laura's father. He had been involved in a series of high-profile criminal cases, but had vanished shortly after a public scandal. The more they uncovered about him, the more chilling it became. Emilio had been close to her father, too close, and now, it seemed, he was just as much a part of the killer's twisted game as anyone else. Roberto and Laura visited the old addresses listed under Emilio's name, but they found nothing but decaying buildings and empty rooms. It was as though he had vanished from the face of the earth, leaving only shadows behind. But the photographs, the masks, the carefully crafted death scenes, they were all pieces of a puzzle that was leading them to one inescapable conclusion. The killer wasn't just targeting random people. He was targeting them, Laura and her team, through a series of personal, painful connections. It was as if the killer was rewriting the script, using them as pawns in his own game. One night, while going through a stack of old police records, Laura made a discovery that chilled her to the bone. There was a mention of a secret project, one that had been shut down years ago. It was a project that had involved the very officers that now worked alongside her. It was a psychological experiment, a way to test how far the human mind could be pushed before it cracked. Her father, Emilio, and several others had been involved in the project, but the details were sparse. No one had ever spoken about it. It had been covered up, buried under layers of bureaucracy and silence. And now, it seemed, the project's legacy had returned. Laura's mind raced. The experiment, whatever it was, had clearly left deep scars on those involved. The killer wasn't just an individual. He was a product of something much darker. And now, the game wasn't just about masks and murder. It was about something far more insidious: revenge. The killer had been part of a forgotten experiment, a twisted piece of history that had been erased, only to resurface now, with a vengeance. The more Laura thought about it, the more she realized that the key to solving this case was not in finding the killer, it was in understanding his motivations. The killer was angry. He was seeking retribution, but not just for the crimes of the victims. He was seeking vengeance for the crimes committed by the people in power, the ones who had buried the truth. Her father had been part of this, but so had Roberto's mentor, and so had countless others who had turned a blind eye to the horror that was created. As the realization hit her, Laura knew that the final confrontation was coming. The killer wasn't going to stop until he'd exposed every dark secret, every twisted sin of those who had wronged him. But there was something more terrifying about this revelation. Her father, Emilio, and the others involved in the project were not just participants. They were the architects of the nightmare that had been unleashed. And now, their creations were coming to collect. This isn't just about masks, Laura whispered to Roberto, her voice filled with dread. It's about exposing everything, and we're part of the game. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she realized just how deep this rabbit hole went. The killer's face, his identity, was no longer the only thing they had to fear. The truth they were about to uncover could shatter everything they thought they knew about themselves. Chapter 7. The confessor. Laura's head spun with the weight of everything she had uncovered. The killer was no longer just a faceless shadow, but a force driven by a singular, unforgiving purpose: to expose the deepest, darkest secrets of those who had wronged him. The connection to her father, the twisted experiments, the forgotten past, everything was falling into place, but it felt like a trap. The killer had known all along what they would find. He had been leading them down this path, pulling the strings until they were hopelessly ensnared in his game. One evening, as Laura sat alone in her office, reviewing case files and photos, she felt a chill creep up her spine. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and for the first time in a long while, She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The door to her office creaked open, and Laura's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't Roberto. It wasn't anyone from the team. Standing in the doorway, his face obscured by a mask she hadn't seen before, was the killer. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The mask was smooth, featureless, with a pair of hollow eyes staring into hers, as if the very soul of the person beneath it was reaching out. There was no sign of aggression in his stance, no immediate threat. Instead, there was a calm, almost unnerving presence about him. It was as if he were waiting for her to speak, to acknowledge the fact that he was standing right in front of her, so close that she could almost feel his breath. "You've been looking for me," the voice said, muffled but unmistakably clear. It was deep, almost soothing, yet there was an edge to it, something cold and calculated that made Laura's skin crawl. "But you won't find me, Laura. Not yet." Her hand instinctively reached for the gun at her side, but she stopped herself. The killer wasn't here to kill her, not yet. He wanted something else. He wanted to talk. He wanted to play. And that was the last thing she wanted to do. "Who are you?" Laura demanded, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Why are you doing this?" The killer tilted his head, as if savoring the question. "Isn't it obvious?" he replied. "I'm giving you what you need. You want answers. You want to know who I am, why I'm doing this. But the truth is, Laura, you've already known me. You've known me for years." The words hit her like a slap to the face. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The killer stepped closer, his movements deliberate, almost casual. "You've been chasing ghosts your whole life, Laura. Your father, your past, none of it is as far away as you think. I've been a part of it all along." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I'm not someone from the outside. I'm someone from your past. Someone who's been watching, waiting." Laura felt a surge of panic rise within her. "You're lying. You're just trying to confuse me," she snapped, her voice thick with emotion. "No, Laura," the killer said softly, almost pityingly. "I'm telling you the truth. You see, the masks I wear, they aren't just for the victims. They're for you too. They're for everyone who's been involved in this twisted little game. Each mask represents a secret, a sin that you've buried so deep, you don't even realize it's there." The killer's words pierced through Laura like a blade. She tried to fight the growing unease, but it was impossible. The masks, the sins, they were all connected to her father, to the team, to everything that had led them here. This wasn't just about murder, it was about something much darker. The killer wasn't just exposing the sins of the victims, he was exposing theirs, her own. "Why me?" Laura whispered, her voice cracking. "Why are you doing this to me? What have I done?" The killer's laugh was low and haunting, echoing in the small room. "You really don't see it, do you? You've always been a part of this, Laura. You've been chasing me for so long, you didn't even realize you were playing my game. Your father abandoned you, but you're just like him. You've been running from your past, from the things you've done, from the things you've allowed to happen." He stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "You've been wearing a mask your whole life, and now it's time to take it off." Laura's hands trembled, and for the first time she felt a wave of self-doubt. Could he be right? Was she just like her father? Had she been running from the truth all this time? The killer's words had a way of worming their way into her mind, twisting everything she had ever believed about herself. And with every word he spoke, the shadows of her past seemed to loom larger, more oppressive. "I've already shown you the truth," the killer continued, his voice like a dark lullaby. "But I'm not finished yet. There's more to be revealed, more masks to be worn. And I'll be here, waiting for you to face what you've been hiding from, what all of you have been hiding from." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Laura standing in stunned silence. The door clicked shut behind him, and she was left alone, her heart racing, her mind spinning with the implications of what he had just said. The game had taken a new turn. The killer was no longer just a shadow to be hunted. He was a confessor, a revealer of truths, and the more he exposed, the more the detectives and Laura herself were drawn into his web. They weren't just hunting a murderer anymore. They were hunting their own sins, their own demons, and the killer was the only one who held the key to their redemption or destruction. Chapter 8. The Final Sin. The night air was thick with tension as Laura stood at the edge of the crime scene, the familiar smell of decay and death clinging to the atmosphere like a shadow. She could feel the killer's presence in every inch of the air around her, like a weight pressing against her chest. It had all led to this moment, the final confrontation, the ultimate reveal. Every lead, every horrifying clue, every cryptic message had been leading them to one inevitable conclusion. They were no longer just detectives chasing a murderer. They were pawns in a game that had been orchestrated long before they even realized they were part of it. This time, it wasn't just another victim. The killer had chosen his target carefully, someone from within the department, someone close to Laura. It was as if the killer knew exactly how to hurt her, how to twist the knife deeper into the fabric of her life. The victim was her own partner, Roberto. Laura's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the lifeless body sprawled on the ground. The mask and eerie, haunting visage of a faceless figure had been placed carefully over Roberto's face. But it wasn't just the grotesque mask that disturbed her. It was the way the scene was staged, the way it mirrored her own darkest fears. "Roberto," Laura whispered, her voice cracking as she knelt beside him. She reached out to touch him, but something stopped her, a cold, gnawing sense of dread. The mask. There was something about it that felt wrong, like it wasn't just part of the killer's usual theatrics. This time, it felt personal. This time, it was a message. The killer wasn't just revealing their sins anymore. He was turning them into his final judgment, a judgment they couldn't escape. Every crime, every mask, every tortured soul had led to this moment. And Laura knew deep down that Roberto was just the first. The killer wasn't done with them. He was going to make them face everything they had hidden for so long, everything they had ignored. The time for playing games was over. Now, it was time for judgment. As Laura stood up, the sound of footsteps approached. She turned sharply, her heart racing, ready for another confrontation. But it wasn't just any footsteps. It was Daniel, her brother, walking toward her with an unreadable expression on his face. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Daniel had been on the outskirts of this investigation from the beginning, too distant to be directly involved, but now he was here. And something in the way he looked at her told her that he knew more than he was letting on. "You were right," Daniel said quietly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the night. "I should have told you sooner. I should have warned you. But I didn't understand, Laura. I didn't see what was happening until it was too late." "What are you talking about?" Laura demanded, her eyes searching his face for some clue, some explanation. She couldn't afford another cryptic answer, not now, not when everything was falling apart. Daniel hesitated, then spoke in a low, almost haunted tone. "The killer, he's not just after you, Laura. He's after the whole department. But there's more. He's been watching us all along. All of us. And he knows everything. He knows the sins we've hidden from the world. And he's using us, using all of you as part of his plan." I was too close to the truth. "That's why he's targeting Roberto. That's why you're next." Laura's stomach turned. "What does that mean? What do you know?" Daniel took a deep breath and stepped closer, his voice trembling. "I didn't know how to tell you, but I've been working with the killer. I've been helping him for years." The words hit Laura like a punch to the gut. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. "What are you saying? You've been helping him? How could you?" "I never wanted this," Daniel interrupted, his eyes filled with shame. "But I was part of the experiment, the same one your father was involved in. I didn't know what I was getting into. I thought I could escape it. But the project, it changed me. It changed all of us. The masks, the sins, they're part of something bigger, something I couldn't see until it was too late. I've been trying to stop it, but the killer, he knew everything. He always knew." Laura's thoughts collided in a storm of disbelief. Daniel, her own brother. He had been working with the killer all this time, a part of the very thing that had twisted everything she knew. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much he had betrayed her, but there was no time for anger. The killer was closer than ever, and the game had reached its final stage. "Then why the hell didn't you stop him?" Laura spat, her fists clenched at her sides. "You've had a chance to end this, Daniel, and you let Roberto die. You let them all die." "I tried," Daniel said quietly, his voice broken. "But the killer, he's not just a man. He's the product of something we created. The project that was supposed to be a test of human limits, but it went wrong. And now, the killer's part of it. He's like a virus, Laura. A virus that spread through all of us. The truth settled on her like a suffocating weight. The killer wasn't just a person anymore. He was the product of something far darker, a twisted legacy that had been passed down through the years. The masks were just symbols of the sins they had all committed, sins that had been buried, forgotten, until now. And the final sin? It was one that Laura had never seen coming. "I've got to stop him," Laura said, her voice resolute. "I can't let him win, not now. Not after everything we've lost." Daniel shook his head, his eyes filled with sorrow. "It's too late, Laura. You don't understand. The game is over. The killer's already won. All that's left is to face the truth." The words felt like a death sentence. But Laura knew deep down that she couldn't back away now. She had come too far. She had uncovered too much. And if she didn't finish this, if she didn't confront the final sin, the killer would never stop. She turned her back on Daniel, her heart heavy with the realization that the last person she had trusted had betrayed her. She stepped toward the crime scene, the weight of the final judgment pressing down on her. The killer's mask might have been over Roberto's face, but in the end, the final mask was meant for her. Chapter 9. The Final Mask. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on Laura from all sides as she moved through the abandoned building. The walls, once white, now cracked and stained with age, seemed to lean toward her, their shadowed corners whispering secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to know. It felt like walking through a tomb, a place where the past had been buried so deeply that it could never be unearthed. But tonight, the past had resurfaced with a vengeance. Laura had always believed that the killer's game was about revealing the hidden sins of others, those whose actions had stained the world around them. But she was beginning to realize something far more horrifying. The game had always been about exposing her own guilt. The killer's meticulous planning, his taunting words, had never been about anyone but her. All the masks, all the victims, they were mere distractions. The final mask was for her, and it was one she could never take off. As she crept through the halls, her breath shallow, her mind racing, she felt his presence long before she saw him. There was a coldness in the air that sent a chill down her spine, an unnatural stillness that whispered of death just around the corner. The killer was close, closer than ever, and this time there would be no escape. "Laura," came the familiar voice, echoing in the vast emptiness of the building. It was his voice, low and calm, but with an undercurrent of malice that made her skin crawl. "You've come so far, haven't you? But you're too late. The game's already been decided." She froze, every muscle in her body tensing. He was here. She could feel it in her bones. But where? The darkness seemed to swallow everything, making it impossible to pinpoint his exact location. It was as if he had become one with the shadows, a ghost haunting the very air she breathed. "I'm not afraid of you," Laura called out, her voice stronger than she felt. She didn't care if he could hear the tremor in it. She was done running, done hiding from the truth. It was time to face him, to end this once and for all. A soft laugh echoed through the building, a sound that sent a shiver through her spine. "Not afraid? You should be. Because, Laura, you've been part of this game from the very beginning. You've been wearing your own mask for years, hiding from the truth. But there's no running now. Not when the final mask is about to be placed on your face." Suddenly, the lights flickered on, blinding her momentarily. As her vision adjusted, she found herself standing in the center of an empty room. The walls were lined with old, dusty mirrors, their surfaces cracked and smudged. But in the center of the room, on a pedestal, stood something that made Laura's heart stop. A mask. It was pristine, untouched, and yet the sense of dread it exuded was overwhelming. It was the final mask, the one that had been designed just for her. And she knew, in that moment, that this was the moment where everything would be revealed. The killer's voice filled the room again, and this time, it was different. It was softer, more intimate, like a whisper meant only for her. "You've always wanted to know who I am, haven't you? You've been chasing me for so long, thinking you could stop me. But you're too late, Laura. The truth is, you already know who I am." Laura's chest tightened. The words hit her like a physical blow. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "No, you're lying. I don't know you. The figure stepped out of the shadows, and Laura's breath caught in her throat. Standing before her in the flesh was a face she hadn't seen in years. The man before her was not a stranger. He was someone she had known intimately, her father, the man who had disappeared from her life long ago, the man who had once been the center of her world. But there was something different about him now. His face was older, his eyes colder, but the mask he held in his hands, the one he was offering to her, was unmistakable. "You've been chasing me for so long," her father said, his voice thick with an emotion Laura couldn't place. "But you never really understood. You were just like me, Laura. You've always been just like me. We both wear masks, but the difference is, you haven't seen your own yet." She stumbled back, her mind racing. It couldn't be. Her father, he had abandoned her. He had disappeared, and now he was here, standing before her, revealing himself as the killer. But the more she looked at him, the more she understood. He wasn't just the killer, he was the embodiment of everything she had ever tried to forget: the sins, the lies, the darkness that had always followed her. He had shaped her, molded her into something she couldn't escape. "Why?" Laura gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do this? Why did you leave me?" Her father's face hardened, his eyes dark with anger and regret. "Because I couldn't protect you, Laura? I couldn't protect you from the truth. And neither can you protect yourself now. The masks, the sins, they're all a part of us. And now, you'll face your own. This is the final judgment." The mask he held in his hands was cold, its eyes empty and staring. Slowly, methodically, he began to approach her, holding it out like an offering. "It's time, Laura," he said, his voice almost tender. "It's time to face who you really are." Laura's mind raced, but there was no escape. She couldn't outrun her past, couldn't hide from the truth anymore. The killer had been right all along. The masks weren't just about the victims, they were about her too. And now, it was her turn to wear the final one. "Don't do this," she pleaded, but the words felt hollow, like they didn't even belong to her. There was no way to stop it now. She had to face this, had to confront the sins she had spent her life trying to bury. Her father stepped closer, the mask still held out before her. "You wanted to know the truth. Now you'll see it. This is the end, Laura. This is the moment when you see who you really are." Chapter 10. The Final Judgment. Laura felt the cold edge of the mask press against her skin, a final, irrevocable connection to a past she had tried desperately to escape. Her father's hands, shaking slightly, held the mask out in front of her, as though it were an offering to something dark, something that would change her forever. There was no denying it now. This wasn't just about the killer, it was about her. She had been a part of this twisted game from the very beginning, and she was about to wear the final mask. For a moment, she stood frozen, staring at her father's face. The man who had abandoned her, the man who had never cared enough to stay in her life, the man who now stood before her, not as a father, but as the architect of all her suffering. The killer had always been close to her, hiding in the shadows, watching, waiting. And now, he was offering her a piece of herself that she had never wanted to face. "You don't have to do this," Laura whispered, her voice breaking, but her eyes locked onto the mask. She knew what it represented. She knew what it would force her to confront: the guilt, the shame, the sins she had buried so deep within herself. Her father's cold eyes were unmoving, his lips pressed into a thin line. There was no pity in him, no love, just a deep, consuming darkness that had festered in his soul for years. "You think you have a choice, Laura?" he asked, his voice low and emotionless. "You've always been part of this. You've always been a part of my design. You never saw it, but I was always there, guiding you, shaping you, molding you into something perfect for the endgame." His lips curled into a cruel smile. "And now, it's time for you to wear the mask." Laura recoiled, instinctively trying to step back, but the darkness pressed in from every angle, leaving her with nowhere to run. Her heart hammered in her chest, and for the first time she could feel the weight of her father's influence in her bones. The killer hadn't just been playing with her, he had been building her up, shaping her into the perfect reflection of his own twisted mind. And now she was the final piece, the last person who would be forced to look into the abyss and accept the sins of her past. "Why?" she asked again, her voice cracking under the strain. "Why do this? Why kill so many people? Why torment me? Her father's eyes darkened. Because it's the only way to bring you to the truth. You were never meant to be like the others, Laura. You were meant to be the one who would finally understand what all of this means. You wanted to solve the puzzle, to understand who I was. But the answer is simple, really. I am you. And you are me. The words hit her like a slap to the face. The realization was so overwhelming that she felt herself stumble, the ground shifting beneath her feet. She wasn't just chasing the killer. She was the killer. She had always been part of this, woven into the fabric of his twisted design. She had spent her life trying to prove she was different, trying to escape her father's shadow, but the truth was undeniable now. She was a reflection of him, his sins, his guilt, his darkness. "Look at me, Laura," her father ordered, stepping closer, the mask still held out in front of her. "You think you've been fighting this, but you've always known the truth, deep down. You've always known that you were never meant to escape your past. You've always been bound to it, and now you'll wear the final mask." With those words, Laura felt her breath catch in her throat. She could hear the muffled sound of her own heartbeat, pounding in her ears, as the mask slowly descended toward her face. Every instinct screamed for her to fight, to resist, but she was paralyzed. The weight of everything, the investigation, her father's betrayal, the lies she had told herself, was crushing her. This wasn't just a mask. It was the final judgment. The moment where she had to confront who she truly was. "Please," Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't want this. I don't want to be like you." But her father's expression remained unchanged. His face as cold and emotionless as it had always been. "You don't get to choose, Laura. Not anymore. You never did." In that moment, something inside her snapped. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was something darker, a realization that she had never been in control, that she had always been just a piece in someone else's game. She could no longer deny it. The killer had won. The final mask was hers to wear, whether she wanted it or not. Her father moved to place the mask on her face, and for the first time, Laura didn't resist. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the truth, to the weight of everything that had led her here. She knew what would happen next. She knew the final revelation would come, and she would have to face it. As the mask touched her skin, she felt a coldness seep into her very soul, as though the mask were a part of her, a reflection of the sins she had always carried but had never acknowledged. The truth was more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. The game had always been about her, and now it was over. There would be no escaping it. There was only one way to go from here, forward. Laura felt a sharp pain in her chest, and suddenly, everything went dark. The Cult of Eternal Night. Chapter 1. The Initial Disappearance. The city of Oscuro had always been known for its eerie tranquility. Located in a secluded valley, the town seemed to be untouched by the hustle and bustle of modern life. The townspeople were used to the long, peaceful days, but it was the nights that gave them a strange, unsettling feeling. As the sun dipped below the horizon, there was a quiet, heavy air that clung to the streets, as if the night itself were watching. Yet, no one could ever quite explain why. It was as if something dark had settled within the city's very bones, waiting, hidden in the shadows. The call came early on a Tuesday morning, disrupting the routine of Detective Evelyn Rios and her partner, Marcelo Herrera. Two young women, Alma Gonzalez and Leah Ramirez, had gone missing without a trace. The disappearance seemed typical, at first rebellious teenagers running away from home, but as the investigation unfolded, it quickly became clear that there was something more sinister at play. The missing girls had been seen together, often with a third figure, Carlos Mendez, a troubled young man with an increasingly disturbing reputation. He had recently become involved in a local secret group known for its strange rituals and cryptic beliefs. Evelyn and Marcelo started their search by visiting the apartment of Alma Gonzalez. It was a small, cluttered space that smelled of incense and stale air. At first glance, it seemed like any other apartment of a young person, but as they began to examine the room more closely, they found unsettling details. On the floor, scattered across the carpet, were strange, almost indecipherable symbols, painted hastily in what appeared to be blood. The shapes were unfamiliar, consisting of concentric circles and sharp, jagged lines that seemed to pulse with a hidden meaning. The air grew thick, and Evelyn felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. These were no teenage scribbles. These were signs of something far darker. Marcelo stepped closer to the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he peered outside. The street was eerily silent. It was the kind of silence that felt almost oppressive, as though the world itself had stopped. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the trees seemed to sway as though reaching for the sky in some twisted dance. Something wasn't right. Evelyn, meanwhile, was leafing through Alma's scattered notebooks. Many were filled with the typical angst of a teenager, scribbled thoughts, rebellious poetry. But one notebook stood out. Its pages were filled with frantic, disjointed sentences written in a hurried hand. One note, in particular, caught her attention. "You can't escape what chooses you." The words rang in Evelyn's mind as she closed the notebook and glanced back at the room. There was something almost preordained about this disappearance, something that suggested these girls hadn't just run away, they had been chosen for something. But for what? The mystery deepened, and Evelyn's instincts told her that this was just the beginning. Their next stop was Carlos Mendez, a local troublemaker. His reputation had taken a sharp turn for the worse in recent months. He had become entangled with a secretive group known as the Order of the Eternal Night. When they confronted him, he seemed unnervingly calm, almost too composed. His responses were evasive, his eyes avoiding direct contact. "What do you know about these symbols?" Evelyn asked, her voice stern. Carlos hesitated before answering, his voice low and shaky. "It's not a cult, it's a path, a way to the eternal flame," he muttered, barely audible. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she processed his words. The eternal flame, it was the same phrase she had seen in Alma's journal. Could this cult, whatever it was, have something to do with the disappearance of these girls? And why had Carlos seemed so nervous? The more Evelyn thought about it, the more she realized that the connection between the two young women and Carlos was not just coincidental. It was part of something much bigger, something dark and ancient. Later that evening, as the detectives walked through the neighborhood, trying to gather more information from the locals, they began to notice a disturbing pattern. Several of the residents, who had once been friendly and talkative, now seemed unusually evasive. One elderly man, Don Fulgencio, a fixture in the area for decades, seemed to know more than he let on. "I saw them," he said in a raspy whisper, eyes darting nervously from side to side. "The girls. I saw them entering an old building near the edge of town, near the Plaza de la Luna." His voice dropped even lower. "But you can't go there. No one goes there. Not anymore." The Plaza de la Luna was a long-forgotten park at the edge of Valle Oscuro, abandoned for years. The detectives had passed it many times without giving it much thought. But now, with Don Fulgencio's words hanging in the air, it felt like a place they needed to visit. Something about it seemed tied to the mystery, as if the very location held the key to unraveling the entire case. When Evelyn and Marcelo arrived at the park, the air felt thick with unease. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the ground was covered in a layer of moss that muffled their footsteps. There, in the distance, stood the old factory, a crumbling structure that had long been abandoned. Its walls were covered in peeling paint and decay, but the faintest traces of symbols, the same ones they had seen in Alma's apartment, were barely visible on the brick. A sense of dread washed over Evelyn as she took a step forward. The factory was silent, its windows dark and hollow, but as they walked closer, Evelyn felt the distinct sensation of being watched. The hairs on her arms stood on end. Marcelo noticed it too, the unsettling stillness in the air. As they entered the building, the feeling intensified, like stepping into a forgotten world, one that hadn't seen sunlight in years. Inside, the space was filled with shadows, broken glass, and dust. But something was different, as if the place had been disturbed recently. There was a faint smell of incense, and the air felt charged with an unnatural energy. They followed the trail deeper into the factory, unaware that the true horror had only just begun. At the far end of the building, they discovered a hidden doorway, concealed by rubble and forgotten debris. It was as though someone or something had tried to keep it hidden, but they had found it anyway. The door was old, wooden, and sealed with a strange lock. adorned with the same symbol they had seen in Alma's apartment. The detectives exchanged a look, both realizing that this was no ordinary investigation. They had crossed a threshold into something darker, something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The truth was just ahead, waiting for them to step further into the unknown. Chapter 2: The Secrets of the Cult. As the detectives ventured deeper into the hidden corridors of the old factory, they began to feel an unnatural stillness, like a weight pressing down on them from all directions. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, but beneath it there was an acrid metallic tang that seemed to come from somewhere deeper inside the building. The further they descended, the more they realized that the factory wasn't just a place abandoned by time, it had become something else. Evelyn felt her skin crawl as the distant sound of something, maybe a whisper, maybe a low growl, echoed from the shadows. Her mind screamed to turn back, but something in her gut told her they were close to uncovering the truth. At the bottom of the stairs, they emerged into a vast underground chamber. The room was dimly lit by old lanterns hanging from the ceiling, their flickering lights casting long, menacing shadows across the walls. The floor was covered in dust and old debris, but as their eyes adjusted to the darkness, Evelyn and Marcello saw something far more disturbing. In the center of the room, there was a large stone altar, weathered and stained with something dark, something that looked disturbingly like blood. Around it, there were faded runes etched into the floor, similar to the symbols they had seen in Alma's apartment. The walls were lined with shelves full of old books, some in Latin, some in languages that Evelyn couldn't recognize. It was clear now, the factory had become a place of ritual, a secret sanctuary for something far darker than they could have imagined. As they cautiously approached the altar, Marcello's flashlight caught something gleaming on its surface. It was a knife, ancient and jagged, its blade coated with dried blood. There was no doubt now that this was no ordinary cult. This was a group that had been performing sacrificial rituals, and based on the condition of the altar and the scattered remnants of what could only be described as arcane offerings, they had been doing so for years. Evelyn's heart raced as she pieced together the images in her mind: the missing girls, the symbols, the whispering voices. All of it led to one horrifying conclusion: the cult of the Eternal Night was real, and it had claimed Alma and Leah as its next victims. They scoured the chamber, searching for more clues, and soon enough, Marcello found a large, leather-bound book tucked away in the corner of the room. It was thick, its cover worn and faded, as though it had been handled by countless hands over the years. Evelyn felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she watched Marcello open it. The pages were filled with symbols, diagrams, and strange incantations. As Marcello flipped through the pages, Evelyn's eyes were drawn to a particular passage: "To the one who surrenders their flesh, the night will come, and with it, immortality." The words seemed to glow on the page, their meaning clear. The cult believed that by performing these rituals, they could achieve immortality by sacrificing their own lives, offering their flesh to the night, a force far older and far darker than anything the world had ever seen. It was then that the detectives realized that the cult's members weren't merely followers of a misguided religion. They were zealous believers, willing to sacrifice themselves for the chance at eternal life. Evelyn's thoughts raced. What kind of madness would drive someone to believe that by dying, they could live forever? How could an entire group be so willing to hand over their lives in exchange for a promise that they would never see fulfilled? She glanced at Marcello, and for the first time since the investigation began, she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But before they could discuss their findings, the distant sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Someone was coming. The detectives quickly doused their flashlights and hid in the shadows, their breaths shallow. The footsteps grew louder, then paused near the entrance of the chamber. Through the darkness, they could barely make out the shape of a figure tall, cloaked in black, and moving with an eerie sense of purpose. The figure stood still for a moment, as though sensing something was amiss, before stepping forward with slow, deliberate movements. It was then that Evelyn saw the cultist's face. His skin was ashen, almost sickly in appearance, and his eyes were glassy, vacant, as though he were no longer fully human. The detective's pulse quickened, and she fought to keep her breath steady. knowing that any noise could alert him to their presence. The cultist passed them by, oblivious to their hiding place, and slowly made his way to the altar. Evelyn's heart beat in her throat as she watched him kneel before the stone structure, placing his hands in an intricate pattern, as if in reverence. He muttered something under his breath, an ancient chant in a language Evelyn couldn't recognize, but the sound sent a shiver through her. It was as though the very words themselves carried a heavy weight, a dark magic that rippled through the air. As he continued his chant, a chill ran through the room, and the shadows seemed to deepen. The temperature dropped several degrees, and the flickering lanterns went out one by one, plunging the room into utter darkness. The figure stood up and moved toward the back of the chamber, leaving Evelyn and Marcello in oppressive silence. They waited for what felt like an eternity before Evelyn dared to speak. "We need to leave," she whispered. Marcello nodded, and they began to back away from the altar, careful not to make a sound. But just as they reached the stairs, a loud crash echoed from deeper in the factory. Both detectives froze. Something or someone had triggered a noise. Was it another cult member, or had they been followed? They wasted no time in retracing their steps, quickly making their way back to the main floor. As they exited the factory, the heavy mist outside seemed to swallow them whole, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. But the feeling of being watched was still there, pressing on them like an unseen force. The detectives were no longer just dealing with a missing persons case. They had uncovered something far worse, a secret cult, a group that had been hiding in plain sight, practicing dark rituals that blurred the lines between life and death. And as Evelyn looked up at the factory's looming silhouette in the distance, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface. Back at their car, the two detectives were silent, their minds reeling with the horrors they had just witnessed. What had they uncovered in that underground chamber? Was it just the beginning of something far worse? As they drove away from the factory, Evelyn's gaze flickered to the rearview mirror. The mist still clung to the streets behind them, but there was something else now, something that made her blood run cold. A figure, standing in the distance, watching them. Evelyn's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She wasn't sure if it was a cultist, a shadow, or something far darker, but whatever it wasn't just a coincidence. The cult had seen them, and it was only a matter of time before they came after them. Chapter 3. The Ritual of Immortality. The chilling sensation that had settled in Evelyn's chest only grew stronger as the days passed. The investigation into the disappearance of Alma and Leah had taken a turn for the worse, leading them into the heart of a dangerous, twisted cult. But what haunted her most wasn't just the eerie symbols or the blood-stained altar they had discovered in the old factory. It was the ritual, the promise of immortality. The idea that the cultists truly believed they could escape death by offering their lives to something darker, something beyond human understanding. She couldn't shake the thought that somewhere out there, in the depths of Valle Oscuro, the cult was preparing for something far worse, something that would shatter the boundaries between the living and the dead. In the days following their discovery, Evelyn and Marcello tirelessly researched the cult's history. What they found was more unsettling than they had imagined. The cult, known as the Order of the Eternal Night, had existed in secret for centuries. They believed that immortality could only be achieved through death, but not just any death. They needed to surrender themselves completely, to give up everything, including their humanity. The cult's ancient text spoke of a ritual so powerful that it could pull their souls into the embrace of an entity known only as the night. According to their beliefs, this night was not a metaphor, but a sentient force, an entity that could grant immortality to those who offered their blood and soul in service. As Evelyn pored over the texts, the sheer madness of it all began to sink in. The cult's followers didn't fear death. They worshipped it, saw it as a path to ultimate power. Their rituals involved complex incantations, sacrifices, and lots of blood, and all of it was tied to the moon, the guiding force that the cultists believed would open the doorway to eternal life. The moon, in their eyes, wasn't just a celestial body, but the gatekeeper to the night, the bridge between the living world and whatever lay beyond. But the more Evelyn read, the more questions arose. What exactly was this entity they worshipped, and what did it want in return for granting such a terrible gift? One afternoon, Evelyn and Marcelo visited a local historian, Clara Reyes, who had written extensively about the dark folklore of Valle Oscuro. Clara's face was a mask of concern when they presented the details of the case. "You have to understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Valle Oscuro isn't just an ordinary town. The land here, it's tainted. It has been for centuries." Clara paused, her eyes flickering nervously around the room as if checking for an unseen presence. The original founders of this town were part of an ancient sect. They believed that the only way to gain true power was through the blood of the sacrificed. The night, it calls to them, pulls them in, and once they're in, they're never the same again. Evelyn felt a chill as Clara spoke. The cult's origins seemed to stretch far back into the town's history, possibly even before its founding. Clara's words only fueled Evelyn's resolve. The town itself, its very foundations, seemed to hold the answers to the cult's dark power. Clara told them of a long-forgotten temple, buried deep within the mountains that surrounded Valle Oscuro. It was said to be the site of the first ritual, the birthplace of the cult's beliefs. The temple had been lost to time, covered by centuries of growth, but Clara believed that it still existed. She explained that the cultists were preparing for something, a massive ritual that was to take place on the next lunar eclipse. It would be their most ambitious ceremony yet, one that would supposedly grant them the power they had been seeking for generations. Clara's warning was clear. If the ritual succeeded, it would bring an end to everything they knew: the town, the people, and perhaps even the very fabric of reality. Determined to stop the cult before they could complete their ritual, Evelyn and Marcelo began the long trek to the temple. Their path was treacherous, winding through dense forests and up steep mountain passes. As they ascended, the air grew colder, the trees more twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The atmosphere felt suffocating, as though the very land was resisting their presence. Every step felt like they were walking further from the world they knew, deeper into something ancient and unnatural. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, and not by any human eyes. It was as though the land itself had been waiting for them, silently observing their every move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the top of a ridge and saw it, the temple. It was an ancient structure, partially covered by thick vines and moss, but still standing strong after centuries of neglect. The stone walls were carved with the same symbols they had seen in the factory, the same jagged lines and concentric circles. The air around the temple was thick with an oppressive energy, a pulse that seemed to vibrate in Evelyn's chest. She could feel it, the darkness that clung to the place, the weight of something waiting to be released. Marcelo, too, seemed uneasy, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. But Evelyn knew that no weapon would be enough to protect them if the cult's power had truly taken root here. They entered the temple cautiously, their flashlights barely piercing the thick darkness that seemed to swallow them whole. Inside, the walls were lined with faded murals, depicting scenes of ritual sacrifices and strange, inhuman figures standing alongside cultists in flowing robes. As they moved further into the temple, the air grew colder, and the low hum of chanting began to echo through the chamber. It was distant at first, but it grew louder as they ventured deeper. The cult was already here, preparing for the ritual. They were getting closer. But the more they moved, the more Evelyn realized that there was something wrong with the temple, something beyond the rituals and symbols. The very stones beneath her feet seemed to vibrate with a pulse that felt almost alive, as if the temple itself was responding to their presence. In the center of the main chamber, there was an altar, eerily similar to the one in the factory. This one, however, was surrounded by candles, dozens of them, their flames flickering and casting long shadows against the walls. And in the center of the altar, there was a human figure, draped in dark robes, standing perfectly still. It was Carlos Mendez. He had been one of the first to disappear. But now, he stood at the center of the ritual, his eyes wide and glazed, his expression vacant. He had already given himself over to the cult. He had become the sacrifice. Evelyn felt a knot form in her stomach as she realized they were too late. The ritual had already begun. Before they could move, the chanting grew louder, more frantic. The air seemed to shimmer, as if something was materializing out of the darkness itself. And then, standing at the very threshold of the altar, a figure appeared. The leader of the cult, a man cloaked in black, his face hidden behind a mask, stepped forward. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she recognized him. Father Santiago, a well-known religious figure in Valle Oscuro, who had always been seen as a beacon of hope in the community. But now, standing before them, he was a shadow, an embodiment of darkness. He had led them all into the abyss. And in that moment, Evelyn realized the full extent of the cult's plan. They weren't just trying to reach the night. They were trying to bring it into this world, to unleash its power and reshape reality itself. Chapter 4. The House of the Leader. The room was shrouded in darkness as Evelyn and Marcelo stepped back into the cavernous chamber of the ancient temple. The figure of Father Santiago, the cult's leader, stood motionless before them, a palpable silence hanging between them like a thick fog. Evelyn's pulse raced as she tried to comprehend the full weight of what was happening. Father Santiago, a revered religious figure in Valle Oscuro, had orchestrated the terrifying plan that would tear apart everything they knew about reality. He was no longer the kindly priest the town had once respected. Now, his true nature, dark and malignant, was on full display. The cult was not merely a group of misguided souls. It was a well-structured machine, with Santiago as its twisted architect, intent on unlocking the power of the night. Marcelo's hand instinctively moved toward his holster, but Evelyn stopped him with a sharp look. There was no point in drawing weapons now. They had seen too much of the darkness that the cult had already summoned. They could feel it closing in on them, seeping through the cracks in the walls, infiltrating their every thought. Santiago's voice suddenly broke the silence, a deep, almost hypnotic tone that seemed to resonate with something primal within the very stones of the temple. "You're too late," Santiago intoned, his eyes glowing faintly beneath the shadow of his mask. "The night has already been awakened. There is no stopping it now. This is the way the world ends, the way it always was meant to end. The boundaries between life and death, light and darkness, will be erased." His words felt like a weight pressing down on Evelyn's chest, like the very air was becoming dense with some unseen force. She realized then that they were standing at the precipice of something far larger than just a ritual. The cult's true purpose was not just to gain immortality, it was to merge the worlds, to tear apart the fabric of existence itself. Evelyn glanced at Marcelo, who was staring at the altar where Carlos Mendez stood, his body now completely still, his eyes fixed ahead, unblinking. He had become the vessel, the offering to the night. The ritual had already begun, and from the look on Santiago's face, it was clear that the cult leader had no intention of stopping now. "What did you do to him?" Evelyn demanded, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. "What have you done to all of them?" Santiago's lips curled into a smile disturbing in its cruelty. "Carlos is only the beginning. He will be the bridge through which the night enters this world. He is the first of many." His voice dropped to a whisper. "You see, the night is not an entity that can simply be summoned. It requires a vessel, someone pure enough to carry it. And when it enters this world, when it takes root, immortality will no longer be a fantasy. It will be a truth." Evelyn could feel a chill rising in her, a sense of dread that seemed to wrap around her like cold, invisible chains. They had come to stop the cult, but it was clear now. The night was already here. As the leader spoke, a low, almost inaudible hum reverberated through the temple, growing steadily louder. Evelyn's eyes darted around the room, and she realized that the symbols carved into the walls were beginning to glow, faintly at first, but then with increasing intensity. It was as if the very temple itself was alive, feeding off the energy of the ritual. The night, whatever it was starting to manifest. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and a thin mist began to seep from the cracks in the stone, swirling around their ankles like some ancient serpent coming to life. Marcelo's hand clenched into a fist. "We can't let this happen," he whispered harshly, his voice filled with a sudden urgency. He pulled out his gun, but Evelyn stopped him once more. "No," she said, shaking her head. "We're dealing with something beyond us. Guns won't stop this." Her words hung in the air like a death sentence, but it was the harsh truth. They were facing something that was not of this world, something that had existed long before their time and would persist long after they were gone. With a sudden movement, Father Santiago raised his arms toward the sky, his cloak billowing behind him as if caught by an unseen wind. He began to chant, the words foreign to Evelyn, an incantation that vibrated in the air with power. It felt like the very fabric of reality was being stretched and pulled, the world itself bending to his will. "The night comes," he said, his voice rising, "and with it, all will be reborn in darkness. No more pain, no more death. Only eternal life, eternal power." As he spoke, the mist around them thickened, swirling violently in a way that seemed almost sentient. Evelyn felt the pressure of it, like the very air was suffocating her, draining her strength. Suddenly, the altar began to glow with an eerie, pulsing light. Carlos, still standing motionless, began to twitch, his hands clenched at his sides, and his head tilted back as though he were being pulled into something beyond human understanding. The night was taking hold of him, and with each passing second, it became more and more clear. The ritual was almost complete. The sky outside had darkened to a blood-red hue, and the distant sound of thunder rolled across the mountains, adding an ominous undertone to the growing tension in the temple. Evelyn's thoughts raced. She had to stop this. They had to stop it, but how? They had no weapons, no knowledge of how to counter the dark magic that was unfolding before them. But then, as if in answer to her desperation, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Near the far wall of the temple was an old, weathered book, its pages torn and yellowed with age. It looked ancient, possibly, the very ritual book that the cult had used for centuries. Without thinking, Evelyn rushed toward it, ignoring the pounding in her chest and the chaos unfolding around her. The book was their only chance. If she could find a way to reverse the ritual, to stop the night from coming, then there might still be hope. But as she reached for the book, Father Santiago's voice boomed, his words filling the temple with an unholy intensity. "You cannot stop what is already in motion," he shouted. "The night is upon you. There is no turning back now. You cannot defy the will of the eternal darkness." Evelyn yanked the book from the shelf and opened it to the first page. As her eyes scanned the symbols, a strange feeling washed over her, like the room was closing in around her, the walls pressing tighter with every passing second. The night was here. Chapter 5. The Lady of Darkness. The sound of chanting still echoed through the ancient temple, reverberating off the stone walls like a haunting melody. The air was thick with power, the sensation of something truly otherworldly beginning to materialize. Evelyn's hands trembled as she held the ancient book, its pages yellowed and brittle, every word inscribed with symbols that seemed to twist and shift in her vision. She was aware of the rising energy around her, the unnatural hum that vibrated through her very bones. The night, the entity the cult had been worshipping for centuries, was no longer just a legend or a distant idea. It was here, and unless she found a way to stop it, the world as they knew it would be lost forever. Her mind raced. She scanned the book desperately, searching for any kind of spell or incantation that could reverse the ritual. Each page she turned revealed more terrifying symbols, more occult teachings that spoke of the night's power, of how it could possess and control, how it could bring an endless, eternal night to the world. But it was all written in a language she barely understood, a combination of Latin, ancient hieroglyphs, and some other demonic tongue that made her head spin. It felt like trying to read a map to a destination that was already disappearing, slipping further and further into the unknown. Marcelo was standing guard near the entrance, his eyes darting back and forth between the altar and Evelyn. He could feel the weight of the ritual's power pressing down on them, but he didn't know what to do. Every instinct told him to protect Evelyn at all costs, but in this moment, he felt helpless. He had fought criminals with weapons, with gangs, with human evil, but nothing had prepared him for this. This was not human evil. This was ancient, primordial darkness, a force that bent reality itself, something beyond the realm of understanding. And there was something else in the air, too, a present something, watching them from the corners of the room. As Evelyn flipped through the pages, the chanting grew louder, more frenzied. Santiago's voice rang out, rising to a crescendo. "The night comes for all of us. We are its heralds. We are its servants. And soon, all of Vallescuro will kneel before it." His voice was a low growl, one that seemed to vibrate through Evelyn's bones. She could feel the dark energy pulling at her, like an invisible force trying to drag her into its depths. Her skin crawled, but then the chanting suddenly stopped. It was as if a switch had been flipped. Silence fell over the temple, thick and suffocating. Evelyn looked up from the book, her heart racing. There, standing at the altar, was the Lady of Darkness. She had appeared from the shadows, her presence so sudden, so quiet, that Evelyn hadn't noticed her approach. The woman was tall, almost ethereal, with long, flowing black hair and pale skin that seemed to absorb the light around her. She wore a gown of dark velvet, adorned with strange silver symbols that glimmered faintly in the dim light. There was something wrong about her, something that didn't belong to this world. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she realized who this woman was. The Dame de la Oscuridad, the one who had been whispered about in the cult's dark texts. Santiago's voice was filled with reverence as he bowed his head before her. Lady, it is done. The vessel has been chosen. The night has been summoned. The Lady of Darkness stepped forward with an otherworldly grace, her eyes glowing with an inner light, and Evelyn could feel the chill in the air intensify. Her presence seemed to pull the warmth from the room, leaving only a void where life once existed. She turned to face Evelyn, her cold gaze locking with the detective's. For a moment, Evelyn thought she could feel the woman's thoughts, entering her own mind, dark whispers, promises of power, and the certainty of death. Do you think you can stop this? The lady's voice was smooth and hypnotic, a velvety whisper that seemed to echo in Evelyn's very soul. You cannot. The ritual is complete. The vessel is prepared. The night will now enter this world, and there will be no more light. Only the endless darkness we have always craved. Her smile was a slow, cruel curve. You have come too late. You are nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience, a small spark in a world already destined to fall into shadow. Evelyn felt the weight of her words, felt the chill of the lady's power pressing down on her. She took a step back, clutching the book to her chest. The weight of failure hung heavy on her. The night was coming, and there was no way to stop it. The Lady of Darkness had taken control. But even as despair began to settle in her chest, a small, stubborn spark of defiance flared within her. She would not let this happen, not without a fight. Marcello's voice broke the silence, shaking but firm. We're not done yet, he said, his eyes locked on the lady. You can't just erase everything we've ever known. We won't let you. The Lady of Darkness's eyes flicked toward him, and for the first time, Evelyn saw a flicker of something like amusement in her expression. She raised one hand, and suddenly the air seemed to thicken around Marcello, the space between them growing charged with an almost tangible force. He gasped, stumbling backward as if struck by an unseen hand. He hit the floor hard, his breath ragged. Evelyn rushed to his side, but the lady's laugh echoed around the chamber, an eerie sound that chilled Evelyn to the core. You don't understand, detective. This world, it was never meant to last. She stepped forward, the very ground beneath her feet seeming to crack and twist, as though the temple was responding to her presence. The night was alive, awakening with every word she spoke. You stand in the path of something far greater than yourselves. This is not just a cult, not just a ritual. It is the end of what you know. The beginning of something far darker. As she spoke, the chamber around them seemed to distort, the walls stretching and bending as though the temple itself were being reshaped. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, pulsating with the rhythm of the lady's presence. The night was coming, and nothing could stop it now. Evelyn felt a wave of despair crash over her, the weight of it pushing her to her knees. But then, something within her snapped. She couldn't give up. Not yet. She looked at Marcello, who was slowly pushing himself to his feet. Despite the overwhelming force that threatened to crush them, Evelyn knew they had to keep fighting. They couldn't let the Lady of Darkness win. Even if the night was almost upon them, even if everything seemed lost, there had to be a way to stop it. There had to be. We can still stop you, Evelyn said, her voice trembling but resolute. We'll find a way. The Lady of Darkness gave a cold smile, the kind that chilled Evelyn's bones. If you truly believe that, detective, you are more deluded than I thought. And then, without another word, she raised her hand, and the darkness around them deepened. Chapter 6. The Revelation of the Temple. The air in the temple felt alive with the rising presence of darkness. The Lady of Darkness, her cold gaze fixed on Evelyn and Marcello, seemed to grow in power with each passing second. It was as though she was feeding off the very fear that now gripped them both. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the ancient book, but she knew, deep down, that its pages held no magic to save them. The ritual had already begun. The night was coming, and nothing they did could reverse it now. What had started as a simple investigation into a series of disappearances had become a battle against something far more ancient and far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. Marcello stood beside her, visibly shaken, but he refused to back down. "There's got to be something we can do," he muttered, his voice strained. "We can't just let this happen. Not like this." He glanced at the Lady of Darkness, her smile never wavering, her expression cold and unfeeling. It was clear that she saw them as nothing more than insects beneath her boot, insignificant and powerless in the face of what she had already unleashed. But Evelyn wasn't ready to accept that. She couldn't. She had seen what this cult was capable of, and now, with the Lady of Darkness standing before them, it was clear. The cult's true purpose was not just to gain immortality, but to bring forth the night itself, an endless, eternal night that would consume everything in its path. She had read enough of the ritual book to understand that the lady wasn't just some leader. She was the key to everything. She was the living embodiment of the cult's dark worship, the one chosen to bring forth the night's power. If they could somehow remove her from the equation, they might stand a chance at stopping this madness. But how? The night was no longer just a distant myth. It had a presence, a will, and it was manifesting right in front of them. The walls of the temple seemed to hum with its power, and the very earth itself seemed to groan in anticipation. The mist that had begun to swirl at their feet was now creeping up the walls, and Evelyn could feel it tugging at her, threatening to swallow her whole. "Evelyn, look!" Marcello's voice broke through the overwhelming silence. He pointed to the altar where Carlos Mendez, the vessel for the ritual, stood motionless. His skin had turned an unnatural shade of gray, and his eyes were open but empty, as if his soul had already been claimed by whatever dark force the cult was trying to summon. But there was something else, something that caught Evelyn's attention. The symbols on the altar, once faint, were now glowing with an eerie, pulsating light. And at the center of the symbols, a strange black mist was rising, forming a swirling vortex above the altar. "This is it," Evelyn whispered, the realization dawning on her. "This is what they've been working toward. This is what they've been trying to summon all along." She stared at the vortex, her heart pounding in her chest. The night was taking form. It was about to cross over into this world, and once it did, there would be no stopping it. The Lady of Darkness stepped forward, her presence radiating an almost tangible dark energy, and Evelyn knew that if they didn't act quickly, the world would be lost. Suddenly, the book in Evelyn's hands seemed to pulse. It was subtle at first, like a heartbeat, but as she focused on it, the rhythm grew stronger. The pages began to turn on their own, as if guided by an unseen force. And then, a blinding flash of light filled the room, and Evelyn was thrown backward. She crashed into the cold stone floor, the book flying from her hands. For a moment, everything went silent. The world spun around her, and she felt as though she were drowning in a sea of darkness. But when she finally opened her eyes, everything had changed. The Lady of Darkness had stopped moving. She was frozen in place, her eyes wide with shock. The dark mist had stopped rising, and the symbols on the walls flickered like dying embers. The vortex above the altar had started to wither, shrinking and collapsing inward as though it were losing its power. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. Was it possible? Had the book somehow disrupted the ritual? Marcello was the first to recover. He rushed to Evelyn's side, pulling her to her feet. "What happened? What did you do?" he asked urgently, his voice full of disbelief. Evelyn's mind was racing. She didn't know. She couldn't explain what had just happened. She had never seen anything like it. But she had the sinking feeling that something had shifted. Something crucial had changed in that moment. The night hadn't been fully summoned, but it had been weakened at least for now, and that was the opportunity they needed. But the Lady of Darkness wasn't going to give up so easily. Her eyes burned with a rage that sent chills down Evelyn's spine. "You dare to interfere?" The lady's voice was a low, guttural growl now, filled with venom. "You are fools. You cannot stop what has already begun. The night will rise, and you will be swallowed by it, just like all the others before you." Her hands rose, and the mist began to swirl around her again, more powerful than before. Evelyn felt the oppressive weight of it pressing in on her, suffocating her with every breath she took. But just as the mist closed in, something unexpected happened. The book, which had been discarded on the floor, began to glow with a soft golden light. The symbols on its pages shimmered, and a deep hum vibrated through the temple, as though it were resonating with the power of the night itself. The Lady of Darkness stopped. Her expression faltered, as if something was preventing her from continuing. The book was fighting back. Evelyn reached for it. As her fingers brushed the pages, a surge of energy shot through her, filling her body with a strange sense of clarity. The golden light began to expand, pushing the dark mist back. The Lady of Darkness shrieked in anger, her hands snapping toward the book, but the light held her back. She couldn't touch it. "No!" she screamed, her voice filled with a mixture of fury and desperation. "You cannot stop it! The night belongs to me!" But Evelyn didn't listen. She opened the book to the page that was now glowing brightly, and a single word appeared, written in ancient script: Aetherus. As she whispered the word aloud, the room seemed to shift again. The walls trembled, and the air vibrated with an unimaginable power. The Lady of Darkness howled, her form twisting and contorting as the light from the book engulfed her. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. The Lady of Darkness was being banished. Chapter 7. The Manipulated Mind. The book was still glowing in Evelyn's hands, its light now diminishing into a soft pulse, as though it had been drained of some of its power. She stood there, frozen in disbelief at what had just happened. The Lady of Darkness was gone, vanished into the swirling darkness that had filled the temple. The mist had receded, and the oppressive weight that had hung in the air was slowly lifting. But Evelyn knew they had only won a small victory. The true battle was still ahead of them. The night wasn't something that could be easily banished, and as long as the cult remained, the dark entity was bound to rise again. Marcello was still catching his breath, his wide eyes locked on the empty space where the Lady of Darkness had stood. His mind was racing, trying to process the chain of events that had led them here. How had the ritual been stopped? And what role did the book play in it? Was it the final key to defeating the cult? Or was it just a temporary reprieve before the worst came to pass? Before Evelyn could answer any of his questions, the ground beneath them rumbled once more, the stone walls shaking violently. She gripped the book tighter, her heart pounding in her chest as a new fear swept over her. Something had changed in the temple, something deeply unsettling. The very air around them had shifted again, and she could feel a growing presence of force that was beneath the surface, biding its time. The mist began to swirl once more, but this time, it wasn't just the Lady of Darkness trying to reclaim control. This was different. The ritual had left its mark on the temple, and something more insidious was coming to life, something that wasn't a creature or an entity, but a force of manipulation. It was as though the cult's twisted power had taken root in the very fabric of the place, infecting their minds. Evelyn looked at Marcello, her eyes narrowing. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, but there was something off about his expression. His eyes darted around the temple as if he were seeing things that weren't there. "Marcello," she began, her voice hesitant. "Are you all right?" Marcello didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze seemed to soften, his brow furrowing as though he were deep in thought. "I'm fine, Evelyn," he muttered, his voice distant. "But there's something here. I feel it. It's like it's calling to me." His eyes glazed over, and for a moment, it was as if he were in a trance, the bonds of reality slipping away. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She had seen this before in the cult members, the strange, almost hypnotic way they behaved, as though they were under some kind of psychological control. And it had become clear now that this wasn't just a matter of dark rituals and summoning entities. The true horror of the cult lay in its ability to manipulate minds, to break down resistance, and to turn even the strongest-willed individuals into tools for their twisted purpose. "Marcello, snap out of it!" Evelyn shouted, stepping forward and grabbing him by the shoulders. His eyes jerked toward her, but they were distant, unfocused. The air around them thickened again, and for a split second, Evelyn could swear that the temple's walls were breathing, expanding and contracting in rhythm with Marcello's every breath. She shook him harder. This is what they've been doing to their followers. The cult. The leader they've been controlling people's minds all along. Marcello's lips trembled as if he were trying to fight some invisible force inside of him. Slowly, his eyes cleared, but there was a brief moment of hesitation before he spoke. "You're right, Evelyn," he said, his voice tight, as though every word was a battle against something suffocating him from the inside. "I can feel it. The pull, the influence. It's like it's reaching into my head, trying to make me believe, to make me submit." Evelyn's heart sank. It wasn't just the Lady of Darkness who was dangerous. The cult's power to manipulate minds had gone far beyond what she had imagined. And now, they had to figure out how to break this hold, how to free Marcello, before he became another lost victim to their insidious influence. But how? What could they do against such a pervasive and deep-seated force? Suddenly, from deep within the temple's stone walls, a low, rumbling sound echoed, like a distant growl or a beast stirring from its slumber. It was the sound of something waking up, something ancient, something alive. The ground beneath them shook again, this time more violently, and the light in the room flickered and dimmed. Evelyn turned toward the source of the noise, her stomach churning with dread. The heart of the cult had always been tied to this place, to the temple, and now that power was spreading. The manipulation was intensifying. It wasn't just a mental game anymore, it was a battle for their very souls. The cult's power was no longer just about creating fear. Now, it was about control. They had been manipulating minds long before Evelyn and Marcello had stepped foot in Valle Oscuro, and now it seemed the influence was beginning to reach its climax. The true face of the cult was being revealed not just in rituals and ceremonies, but in the quiet, unseen ways. It slowly stripped people of their identities, their free will, turning them into mere puppets in service to something far darker than anyone had imagined. Evelyn took a deep breath and stepped closer to Marcello, trying to ground herself in the real world before the invisible forces of the cult could overwhelm her. The walls around them seemed to close in, the air growing heavier by the second. "Marcello, you have to fight it. Focus on who you are, on why you're here." Her voice was firm, but beneath the surface, she was terrified. Because deep down, she knew that if Marcello fell, it wouldn't just be him who was lost, it would be everything. Marcello's eyes locked with hers. For a moment, the mist in the air seemed to settle, the oppressive force lifting ever so slightly. He was fighting, but she knew that time was running out. The cult's dark influence was pervasive, insidious, and it had already taken root in Valle Oscuro. If they didn't act now, the entire town would fall under its sway. And from there, the night would come. Chapter 8. The final ritual. Evelyn and Marcello had barely had time to recover from the overwhelming grip of the cult's influence before the ground beneath them shifted violently. The temple was alive with an unnatural pulse, a deep hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The air had grown thick with a scent of damp earth and ancient incense, and the shadows cast by the flickering torches seemed to stretch unnaturally long. As they stood on the precipice of what could be their final moments, the overwhelming sense that they were too late settled in their bones. The ritual was already underway. "Marcello, we need to stop this," Evelyn whispered urgently, though her words were swallowed by the ominous hum of the temple. Her hand trembled as she clutched the book, knowing that it was their last hope. But even as the light from the pages seemed to flicker weakly, she feared it might not be enough. There was too much power in this place, too much darkness had been awakened, and the cult's leader, the one who held the final key to the ritual, was still out of reach. Marcello nodded, his face grim. His eyes were clear now, the psychological manipulation weakening its hold over him, but he still felt the lingering presence of the cult's power in his mind, like an invisible thread trying to pull him back into the fold. "We've come too far, Evelyn. We have to finish this, whatever it takes." His voice was resolute, but there was a trace of fear in his eyes. Fear of what would happen if they failed. The ground rumbled again, and the altar ahead of them began to glow with an intense red light. Figures dressed in dark robes were moving around it, chanting in low, guttural tones, their voices merging into a terrifying chorus. The cult was readying itself for the final ritual, the one that would bring the night to life, a night that would last forever, devouring everything in its path. Evelyn could see it now, the leader of the cult, standing at the center of the altar, his arms raised high in a twisted form of worship, the symbol of the Noche Eterna carved into his chest. "That's him," Evelyn said, her voice low and filled with dread. "That's the one who started all this." The leader's name was Antonio Cordero, and he had been the mastermind behind the cult's twisted beliefs. His influence had spread through Valle Oscuro like a virus, corrupting minds, causing people to disappear, to vanish without a trace, drawn into his web of deception and death. He was a man who believed that in order to gain immortality, one must sacrifice others, each life taken, a step closer to the night itself. But Evelyn knew this ritual wasn't just about sacrificing lives. This was different. This was about awakening something ancient, something beyond death, a force that could control the very fabric of time and space itself. It was a dark god, and Antonio believed that by offering his own life as the final sacrifice, he would unlock the power of the night eterna and become its eternal master. The thought of such unimaginable power terrified Evelyn. If he succeeded, there would be no stopping him, no stopping the night. Suddenly, the chanting grew louder, and the symbols on the walls began to glow with an eerie, pulsing light. The temple itself seemed to be shuddering with the force of the ritual. The air grew thicker, as if every breath was filled with smoke, every step heavier than the last. Evelyn glanced at Marcelo, and she could see the tension in his eyes, the realization of what they were up against. There was no turning back now. They had to stop it here, or the entire town would fall, and so would the world. Without another word, they moved forward, slipping into the shadows. Evelyn could feel the weight of the book in her hands, its pages filled with knowledge they had barely begun to comprehend. She knew that somehow, the book held the key to undoing the ritual, if they could decipher its cryptic passages in time. But first, they had to get close to the altar, close enough to stop Antonio, before the ritual reached its climax. As they crept closer, the air grew colder, and a deep sense of foreboding washed over them both. It was as if they were walking into the heart of darkness itself. The shadows seemed to close in on them, warping the space around them. And then, the voice of Antonio Cordero rose above the chant, his voice filled with ecstasy, as though he were already on the brink of his victory. "The time has come," he cried, his arms outstretched as he prepared to give his life to the night. "Let the eternal darkness reign." Evelyn's heart raced. They were running out of time. Now or never. With a sudden burst of courage, she lunged forward, forcing herself past the barrier of shadows that seemed to cling to the edges of the temple. Marcelo followed closely behind, but they were quickly spotted. The cultists turned to face them, their eyes glowing with a disturbing zeal, their faces twisted in cruel smiles. They began to chant louder, their voices rising in unison, as if trying to drown out all reason, all logic, in favor of pure, unrestrained faith. Antonio Cordero turned slowly, his eyes widening as he saw them approaching. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in his gaze. Then, his expression twisted into something far darker. "You think you can stop it?" he hissed, his voice like a snake's. "You are too late. The night has already claimed me." Before Evelyn could react, he raised his hand, and the ground trembled violently beneath their feet. The symbols on the altar began to spin, and the red light flared to life, shooting toward the ceiling like a beacon. Evelyn could feel the power surging through the air, pressing in on her, suffocating her. The book in her hands began to pulse again, and for the first time, Evelyn felt like she was connected to something greater, something beyond the ritual, beyond the dark forces surrounding them. Marcelo grabbed her arm. "We have to stop this, Evelyn. He's too powerful." "No," she replied, her voice firm. "The book. It's the only way." She turned toward the altar, her voice trembling with the weight of what she was about to do. "We have to destroy the ritual. We have to stop him." With a final, desperate effort, Evelyn opened the book to its final page, and as she did, a flood of light shot out from the pages, enveloping them both. The power surged through her, and for a moment, the world slowed. Everything went quiet, and in that stillness, she saw the truth. The ritual could still be stopped, but only if Antonio was severed from the power of the night itself. The book's light grew stronger, and the energy began to push the cultists back, their eyes filled with terror as the ritual unraveled before them. Antonio Cordero's expression twisted into a snarl of rage. He was losing control, but he wasn't going down without a fight. "No!" he screamed, his hands reaching out to grasp the energy around him. But it was too late. The light consumed him. The ritual was undone. Chapter 9. The End of the Night. The light from the book flickered once more before dissipating into the air, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Evelyn stood in the center of the altar, her hands still trembling from the surge of power she had just unleashed. The room was no longer the eerie, twisted place it had been moments ago. The walls had stopped glowing, the chanting had ceased, and the oppressive weight that had filled the air had lifted, but there was no sense of peace, no relief. Instead, there was a deep, gnawing emptiness. The ritual was broken, but the night had not fully ended. Evelyn glanced at Marcelo, who was still catching his breath, his face pale from the intensity of what they had just endured. His eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of confusion, fear, and relief. Did we stop it?" he asked, his voice strained. His words seemed to echo in the now silent temple, but they felt hollow, as if they were asking a question that had no answer. "We did," Evelyn replied, though she could barely bring herself to believe it. The book, now lying open in her hands, felt like a relic, its pages worn and fragile. She could feel the weight of the history it carried, dark, ancient knowledge that had nearly been used to bring forth a nightmare. But there was something in the air that told her this wasn't over. The night had been held back, but it had not been completely defeated. It was still there, lingering just beyond the edges of their reality, a dark presence that would never fully release its grip on the world. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a low groan, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as the ground beneath them began to tremble again, more violently than before. The stone altar cracked in half, the fissures glowing with an eerie, pulsing light. The symbols that had been carved into the stone began to shift, their shapes warping and twisting in unnatural ways. The ritual had failed, but its effects hadn't been completely undone. Marcelo stepped forward, his expression grim as he scanned the shifting altar. "It's not over. This thing, it's still trying to get out." His voice was filled with desperation. It was clear to both of them now that the entity they had been fighting wasn't just a cult's belief. It was a real, tangible force, something far older and more powerful than anything they had imagined. Evelyn nodded, clutching the book tighter. "We have to finish what we started." She glanced around the temple, looking for any signs of the cultists who had once surrounded the altar, but they were gone. The ritual had destroyed them, their bodies reduced to nothing more than ash. Antonio Cordero, too, was nowhere to be found. It was as if the very essence of the cult had been swallowed by the dark energy they had unleashed. But the temple was still alive with darkness, and Evelyn could feel its pull, calling to her, testing her resolve. "Do you feel it?" she whispered to Marcelo, barely able to hear her own voice above the pounding of her heart. "It's still here." The air around them had grown cold, a biting chill that sank deep into their bones. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and writhe, moving as if they had a life of their own. The very walls of the temple appeared to shift again, as if they were trying to close in on them, trapping them in a place that no longer followed the rules of reality. Marcelo turned toward her, his face set with determination. "We can't leave until we make sure it's truly over." He stepped forward, moving toward the altar once more, where the cracks in the stone had opened up like a mouth, waiting to swallow everything whole. Evelyn followed him, the book now feeling heavier than it ever had before. She couldn't explain it, but she knew that the temple had to be sealed off entirely, or else its power would continue to leak into the world. They had already come so far, and they couldn't afford to fail now. With a final deep breath, Evelyn stepped to the altar's edge. The cracks in the stone pulsed with energy, and as she placed the book upon the altar's surface, the room seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, nothing happened. The darkness that surrounded them remained still, as if waiting for the final act. And then, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the temple's ceiling, the symbols on the altar began to glow one last time, their lines moving with an almost organic fluidity. Marcelo reached out, his hand hovering over the book. What now? How do we stop it for good? He sounded almost defeated, as though the weight of the night had finally broken him. Evelyn took a step back and closed her eyes. She didn't know how she knew, but she knew that the answer was in the book. Everything they had done, everything they had learned, had led to this moment. The book held the final key, the final incantation to sever the last connection to the dark entity, to seal it away once and for all. She could feel the power in her fingertips, the book resonating with her energy. It was calling to her, guiding her. We seal it, Marcello. We seal the night for good, Evelyn said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of the decision they were about to make. She opened the book and began to chant the words written on the final page, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. As she spoke, the stone beneath her feet began to rumble, the air growing thick with tension. Marcello stepped back, watching her intently, but he couldn't look away as the room seemed to react to her words. The cracks in the altar began to close slowly, the light pulsing in time with the words she spoke. But with every word, the energy in the room increased, and Evelyn knew that the final price of stopping the night was something she might not be ready to pay. The ground shook harder, and the shadows seemed to rise up, rushing toward her. But Evelyn didn't stop. She couldn't stop. There was no going back now. Her voice rose higher, louder, until it echoed through the temple. The last word she spoke was the key. The energy exploded outward, and the altar shattered, sending a blinding light into the air. Then, silence. The room was still. The cracks in the altar were gone, and the eerie glow had disappeared. The shadows receded, the unnatural chill lifted, and for the first time, Evelyn felt a sense of peace, however fleeting. She had done it. They had done it. The night was sealed, and the cult's influence was broken. But even as they stood there, in the quiet aftermath of the ritual, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness would always linger. It would always be there, just beyond the edge of their perception, waiting for the next fool to come looking for it. Chapter 10. The Dawn After the Night. As the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the temple's ancient stone walls, Evelyn and Marcello stood motionless, their breaths still shallow from the sheer force of the ritual's culmination. The once oppressive atmosphere had lifted, leaving behind an eerie calm that felt almost unnatural. The altar, now reduced to rubble, no longer hummed with dark energy, and the symbols that had once wriggled and shifted like living things were now inert, their power seemingly drained away. But the sense of finality was elusive, as though the temple was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Evelyn let out a long breath, her body sagging with exhaustion. Her hands, still gripping the book, trembled violently. The weight of what they had done, of what they had faced, was slowly settling in. The ritual had been stopped, but she knew that the toll of this battle was far from over. Marcello stood beside her, his gaze lost in the ruins of the altar, his face drawn and pale, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. Relief that they were alive, that they had stopped the cult and its leader. But even now, that relief seemed fleeting. "We did it," Evelyn whispered, though she wasn't sure if she truly believed it. "It's over." But the words felt hollow in her mouth. The ritual had been broken, Antonio Cordero was gone, and the cult was no more. And yet, something about the empty temple seemed to mock their victory, as though the darkness hadn't been entirely erased. It still lingered perhaps in the cracks in the walls, or in the space between their breaths. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the night was not quite finished with them yet. Marcello turned toward her, his voice soft. "Is it really over, though? I can't help but feel like we've just paused something that was inevitable." His words sent a chill through Evelyn, for she knew what he meant. It was the same nagging feeling that had plagued her throughout this entire ordeal. The sense that darkness was not something that could ever truly be destroyed. It was something that would always find a way back, like a fire smoldering beneath the ashes, waiting for the right moment to reignite. "Maybe it is, and maybe it isn't," Evelyn replied, wiping the sweat from her brow. "But for now, we've stopped it, and that's all we can do." She paused, glancing at the ruins around them. "We'll leave this place, Marcello. We'll get back to the town. They'll be safe, at least for now." She didn't mention the fact that she didn't know how long the peace they had created would last. That was a question she wasn't ready to answer. Together, they made their way toward the entrance of the temple. The path was clearer now. The heavy shadows that had once seemed to swallow them were now mere whispers of what had been. The once oppressive weight of the temple had receded, leaving behind a sense of quiet that felt almost sacred. But as they stepped out into the open air, the quiet was replaced by the unmistakable sound of birds, the rustling of leaves in the early morning breeze. For a moment, it felt like they had emerged from a long nightmare. They were back in the real world, free from the cult, free from the night. But even as they made their way through the woods and toward the town, Evelyn felt the world shift around her. She wasn't sure what it was, a strange weight on her chest, a growing unease in the pit of her stomach, but it was there, like a shadow, just out of sight, following them. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the cultists standing there, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. But the woods were empty, the silence unbroken. As they reached the outskirts of Valle Oscuro, the town came into view, still bathed in the soft light of dawn. Everything seemed normal. People were stirring in their homes, the early morning fog rolling off the streets as life went on as it always had. Evelyn and Marcello exchanged a look, both of them silently wondering if the town would ever truly be free of the influence of the cult, or if its grip had been permanently embedded in the hearts of the people who had been touched by it. "I don't know if we can ever really leave this behind," Marcello murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if we can go back to the way things were." His words hung in the air, unspoken fears that both of them shared. Could they go back to normal lives after everything they had seen? Could they simply forget the horrors they had witnessed? Or had those memories carved themselves into their souls, leaving scars that could never fully heal? Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath, trying to clear the fog from her mind. They had done their part. They had stopped the ritual. But the idea of returning to a world that hadn't seen what they had seen, that hadn't experienced the horror they had faced, seemed impossible. How could she go back to her everyday life, knowing that there were still people in the world who believed in the kind of darkness she had just destroyed? People who would seek it out, like Antonio Cordero had, believing they could control it, manipulate it. As they entered the town, the streets felt almost surreal, as though they were walking through a place that no longer belonged to them. The townspeople didn't seem to notice them at first, too wrapped up in their own lives, but soon a few curious glances turned toward them. Evelyn and Marcello were marked now, changed by everything they had seen and experienced. The darkness they had fought would never be completely gone from their hearts. The town's safety was temporary. There were always those who sought to resurrect the cult, always those who believed in the dark gods and eternal nights. A small voice in the back of Evelyn's mind whispered that the cult had been destroyed, but the darkness itself would never die. It would always wait for the right time, for the right people, to bring it back. And as the sun continued to rise, casting long shadows across the sleepy town, Evelyn couldn't help but wonder if they had truly sealed the night away, or if they had simply postponed its return. Would Valle Oscuro always be haunted by the specter of the cult? Would they ever truly be free of its influence? The answer, as much as Evelyn wanted to deny it, was something she couldn't yet understand. For now, all they could do was live their lives, carry on, knowing that somewhere in the world, the darkness was still waiting, patient and eternal, for its next victim. And so, they walked into the sunrise, leaving behind the ruins of the past and stepping into a future where the shadows would never truly vanish.